Tom had driven logging trucks through the remote northern wilderness for nearly 20 years. Rough, steady, and as tough as the landscape itself, he was no stranger to the dangers of hauling massive loads through isolated forest roads. On May 22, 2025, he found himself deep in the wilds of an island where nature still ruled and humans tread lightly. The region was known for its dense berry patches, a critical food source for the island's massive native bears, immense, powerful creatures with reputations as unpredictable as the shifting weather. Tom was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered and weather-beaten, with a calm demeanor forged by decades on the road. That afternoon, his logging truck rumbled along a narrow, gravel-lined path cutting through thick spruce and alder. The engine had been acting up all morning, sputtering and coughing as if struggling to breathe. Suddenly, just as he rounded a sharp bend, the engine died completely. The truck rolled to a stop beside a lush patch of ripe berries. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by distant bird calls and the faint rustle of wind in the trees. Frustrated, Tom shut off the ignition and climbed down from the cab. His boots sank slightly into the soft, mossy ground as he approached the hood, intent on diagnosing the problem. The engine hissed faintly as it cooled, and Tom reached for his toolbox, scanning his surroundings. The berry patch stretched several yards, the bushes heavy with dark purple fruit. He was aware these berries attracted bears, but he hadn't seen any fresh tracks or signs nearby. Unbeknownst to him, a massive bear was feeding just 20 meters away. Its thick fur shimmered in the dappled light, and its enormous shoulders hunched as it tore handfuls of berries with powerful jaws. The animal was a giant, easily standing 8 feet tall when upright, with curved claws and eyes filled with fierce intelligence. It appeared absorbed in its meal and seemingly unaware of Tom's presence. Tom worked quickly, checking hoses and wires under the hood. Then the atmosphere changed. The bird calls ceased, and a heavy silence settled over the forest. A chill ran down his spine as unease crept into his chest. Moments later, the bear's head rose sharply, its eyes locking on Tom. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The bear rose to its full height with terrifying speed, unleashing a guttural growl that echoed like thunder through the trees. Tom froze, heart pounding. He barely had time to react before the massive creature charged, its powerful limbs thundering against the earth. Tom stumbled backward, but the bear closed the distance with frightening speed. With a violent swipe, it knocked him off his feet, sending him crashing to the ground beside the truck. Pain tore through his leg as claws shredded both fabric and flesh. The animal's teeth sank into his calf with crushing force. Driven by sheer survival instinct, Tom crawled desperately toward the truck's door. Every movement was agony, and blood blurred his vision. Still, he managed to grip the door handle and wrench it open just as the bear prepared to strike again. He slammed the door shut and locked it, gasping for breath as the truck's frame became his only shield. Outside, the bear circled the vehicle, pounding the metal with massive paws. The noise shook the cab and rattled Tom's nerves. It growled low, its breath steaming in the cool air. After circling once more, the bear eventually turned and lumbered away into the thick forest, leaving Tom bloodied but alive. Time passed slowly as Tom sat trembling, fighting the pain and trying to stay alert. He reached for his radio and called for help, his voice weak but steady. Within the hour, a rescue team arrived, and he was airlifted by helicopter to the nearest hospital. Doctors found deep wounds, torn muscle, and crushed bone in his left leg. He would survive, but the road to recovery would be long. The attack left more than physical wounds. Tom's experience drew attention to the growing conflict between human industry and native wildlife habitats in isolated regions. As logging operations pushed deeper into once untouched forests, encounters with large predators had become more frequent and far less predictable. Wildlife experts pointed to the incident as evidence of a broader ecological issue. Animals that once roamed vast, undisturbed territories were now forced into shrinking habitats, their food sources increasingly shared with or disrupted by humans. The berry patches, once peaceful feeding grounds, were now flashpoints of conflict between industry and nature. Tom's experience was a stark example of how sudden and violent the response from the wild could be when provoked by human encroachment. In the weeks following the incident, the logging company implemented new safety protocols, including mandatory wildlife awareness training. Tom, once just a driver, became an advocate for education and coexistence. He began sharing his story in meetings and interviews, urging both workers and decision-makers to take bear behavior and habitat preservation seriously. Though his body healed slowly, his outlook on the wilderness changed more profoundly. Tom never blamed the bear. He recognized it as a territorial animal reacting to intrusion, not as a villain. The incident revealed how thin and fragile the line was between civilization and the untamed world. One misstep could turn a routine day into a life-threatening encounter. As Tom recovered, he gained a deeper sense of humility and caution. The logging truck that had nearly become his coffin was eventually repaired and returned to service. Still, the memory of that day lingered, the moment when the forest reminded him of its power. The bear had shown him the unforgiving strength of the wild, and Tom had survived to share that truth. Survival in these lands required respect, not just preparation. Ethan was a wildlife photographer driven by passion and patience. In his late 20s, with sharp eyes behind a camera and a quiet, determined nature, he pursued moments few ever witnessed. Images of Kodiak bears in their prime, feeding along the salmon-rich streams of Alaska's remote island wilderness. On May 15, 1995, he and his guide, Mark, ventured deep into the dense terrain of Kodiak Island, intent on capturing the early salmon run and the bears that followed it. Mark, a seasoned outdoorsman in his early 40s, knew the island well. He was familiar with its unforgiving terrain and the unpredictable behavior of its massive bears. His years in the wild had taught him caution and respect, lessons he tried to pass on to Ethan, reminding him that in bear country, the line between observer and intruder could vanish in an instant. The two men moved carefully, navigating through thick forest and over rocky ridges, following the path of salmon upstream. On their second day, they found a promising spot along a swift-moving river, where the water churned red with spawning fish. The air was damp and cool, heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. Ethan, eager to find the perfect angle, ventured ahead alone, camera in hand, eyes scanning the shoreline for a glimpse of bear activity. Unbeknownst to him, a dominant male Kodiak bear was already nearby, massive, battle-scarred, and watching. The bear lay low among the brush, keenly aware of its surroundings. It was the undisputed ruler of this stretch of river, and anything unfamiliar in its territory could be perceived as a threat. Earlier that morning, Ethan had flown a drone to scout the riverbank, looking for prime vantage points. The buzzing machine had flown low, skimming the treetops and disturbing the natural quiet. The noise had unsettled the bear, stirring unease and irritation. Though it hadn't reacted immediately, the intrusion had left a mark, a rising tension beneath its calm. As Ethan moved unknowingly downwind of the bear, he advanced too quickly and too close. The uneven terrain, a tangle of moss-covered rocks and fallen branches, made it difficult to remain silent or to retreat easily. From his position farther back, Mark noticed the shift in the bear's posture and shouted a warning, but his voice was muffled by the roar of the river and the thick foliage. Then, the bear charged. Its speed was terrifying. In seconds, it covered the short distance between itself and Ethan, who had just registered movement in the brush when the bear was upon him. He dropped his camera and turned to flee, but the rough ground slowed him, his boots slipping on the wet earth. The bear reached him in moments, its massive jaws clamped around Ethan's torso with staggering force, driving him to the ground. The silence of the wilderness shattered with the sound of breaking branches and the muffled impact of the struggle. Ethan fought, scrambling and twisting, but the bear's strength was overwhelming. It bit and struck with primal fury, likely reacting not just to his presence, but to the earlier disturbance caused by the drone. Mark sprinted toward the scene, heart pounding, radio in hand. He saw the bear pause, momentarily distracted by Mark's sudden approach, then vanish into the forest, slipping into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. Mark reached Ethan's side and radioed for rescue, describing the attack and their location with urgent precision. Hours passed before teams arrived, navigating dense brush and uneven ground to reach them. When they finally did, they found Ethan gravely injured, motionless among the branches and blood-stained soil. Despite their efforts, he had not survived. The tragedy left an impact far beyond the isolated riverbank. Investigators later concluded that the drone had agitated the bear earlier in the day, contributing to its heightened aggression. Wildlife experts pointed to the incident as a stark warning. In wilderness areas, especially during critical feeding periods, small disturbances can have unpredictable and deadly consequences. The story made waves within both the wildlife photography community and the broader public. It reignited debate around the use of drones in natural habitats and led to renewed calls for stricter guidelines and education for those working in close proximity to large predators. Mark carried the weight of the experience long after the forest fell silent again. Ethan had been more than just a client. He was a young man fueled by awe and creativity, chasing beauty in its rawest form. The photo he had hoped to capture would never exist, replaced instead by the memory of a life cut short in the pursuit of it. The attack became a solemn lesson in the fragile balance between humanity and the wild. Kodiak Island, with its rugged beauty and enormous bears, was not a place for careless movements or unfamiliar technology. It demanded respect, always. In time, a memorial was quietly placed near the river's edge, where salmon still swam and bears still roamed. It served as a quiet reminder of Ethan's passion, his final journey, and the enduring truth that in places untouched by roads or fences, nature's rules are absolute and unforgiving. As a scientist who had devoted her life to studying the Arctic's fragile ecosystem. At 34, she was no stranger to harsh conditions and isolation, having spent years conducting fieldwork in some of the most remote parts of the world. Driven by a fierce passion to understand how climate change was reshaping this frozen wilderness, she set out alone in mid-July 2025 on an expedition deep into the Arctic tundra, hundreds of miles from any human settlement. That day, the weather shifted suddenly and violently. A rare summer storm rolled in, sweeping across the tundra with fierce winds that bent the sparse grasses and whipped ice patches into slick hazards. Heavy gray clouds obscured the sun, and a sharp chill settled into the air, unusual for the brief Arctic summer. Despite the deteriorating weather, Emma pressed on. She had a clear goal: reach an old Inuit cabin marked on her map, a small shelter she hoped would provide refuge from the storm, and a base to conduct her research. The cabin stood weathered and worn, its wooden frame bleached by years of sun, snow, and wind. The windows were dark, some cracked, the door heavy but intact. Emma hurried inside, pulling the door shut behind her and securing it with a sturdy bolt she found inside. The shelter was cold and musty, smelling faintly of old wood, ice, and a forgotten past. She set down her gear and tried to steady her breath, thankful for the shelter from the sudden downpour that had started outside. Unbeknownst to Emma, she was not alone. A massive polar bear had been moving nearby. It had been following the scent of a seal carcass frozen just a few hundred meters from the cabin. The bear's hunger was desperate. For days, the shrinking sea ice had pushed it farther inland, away from its traditional hunting grounds. Its keen nose picked up Emma's scent and traced it to the cabin. Driven by hunger and curiosity, the bear approached silently, moving with terrifying purpose through the whipping wind and rain. Inside the cramped cabin, Emma was unaware of the approaching danger. She checked her equipment, preparing to gather data the next morning. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by a violent crash. The side window exploded inward with a deafening crash of shattering glass. Sharp shards flew through the air like deadly rain as the bear's enormous paw smashed through the opening. Emma's heart jumped into her throat as she scrambled backward, clutching the flare gun she always carried for emergencies. The bear swiped again, powerful muscles flexing as it battered the cabin's walls and door. The wooden frame shook with each blow, splinters raining down around her. She was trapped inside, the storm outside forgotten in the terrifying immediacy of the bear's presence. The bear circled the cabin, growling low and fierce, its hot breath steaming in the cold air. Emma crouched low, every nerve screaming with fear and adrenaline. She gripped the flare gun tightly, her arms trembling. The bear's weight and fury tested the walls, swiping violently through the shattered window. On one swipe, broken glass sliced into Emma's arm, sharp pain exploding as blood welled quickly. Minutes dragged torturously. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing. The storm's howl mingled with the bear's guttural roars and the violent thuds against the cabin. Her arm throbbed, a burning ache, but the flare gun remained her only hope. Then, summoning every ounce of courage, she raised the flare gun and fired a blazing projectile into the ceiling. The sudden burst of light and fire ignited a patch of old wood and dry debris. Sparks flew wildly, smoke billowed thick and choking. The bear recoiled, startled by the unexpected inferno, its growls turning to confused snarls as it took a hesitant step back. Seizing the moment, Emma backed toward the window, eyes darting for an escape or rescue. Outside, the storm still raged, but faint sounds of distant voices and flashlights pierced the darkness. Hours earlier, her camp's satellite signal had triggered an alert, prompting a search team to deploy in the severe weather. The bear, confused and wary of the fire, eventually retreated into the storm shadows. Emma collapsed near the door, exhausted, bleeding, but alive. The rescue team arrived moments later, moving carefully with tranquilizer guns and first aid. They found the cabin battered, the walls clawed and blood-stained, shards of glass everywhere. Emma was airlifted to a distant field hospital. Her arm was treated for deep lacerations and shock. Despite the trauma, she survived. Her survival was a testament to her quick thinking, resilience, and the flare gun's crucial role. Her ordeal underscored a stark and growing reality. Climate change was rapidly transforming the Arctic landscape, melting sea ice and shrinking polar bear hunting grounds. As their natural food sources disappeared, bears were forced closer to human settlements and shelters, increasing the frequency of unpredictable and dangerous encounters. Emma's harrowing experience became a chilling example of this new reality. It revealed how these apex predators, pushed by hunger and desperation, could become aggressive in ways previously rare or unseen. It was a warning to scientists, explorers, and residents alike. Human presence in the Arctic wilderness now carried more risk than ever before. The balance between man and wild was shifting. The old separations that had kept humans and polar bears apart were eroding under the relentless advance of climate change. Emma's attack was not an isolated event, but part of a troubling pattern of closer, more volatile contact between species struggling to survive. As she recovered, Emma knew her research would have to adapt. Studying the Arctic now meant more than tracking melting ice and declining seal populations. It meant understanding the human-wildlife conflicts intensifying in the tundra's changing face. The storm that had forced her into the cabin, the bear that had shattered the window, and the flare that had saved her life, all were pieces of a story far bigger than one person's struggle. They were signs of a planet in flux, a wilderness in crisis, and the dangerous new frontier of survival in a warming world. The sun had only risen when Emily stepped onto the narrow, unmarked trail that twisted through the backcountry of a national park in the northwest corner of Wyoming. A quiet morning mist clung to the trees, and birds chirped in the upper branches. Emily, 29, a passionate solo hiker from Oregon, was no stranger to long, isolated treks. She had spent years hiking alone, documenting her journeys through photos and journal notes. This weekend, she had chosen a route she found on an old forum, quiet, remote, and barely touched. She started hiking light before dawn, her gear tucked into a small backpack. Noise-canceling headphones blocked out everything but the soft piano music she loved. The sound calmed her. She wasn't worried. She had bear spray and a whistle and knew the typical guidelines, but she preferred silence over the crunch of boots and wind in the trees. It made her feel free. The trail was overgrown, framed by thick lodgepole pines and dense underbrush. She had seen no one since leaving the trailhead. Around mile 5, the forest closed in tighter and she slowed. A shallow stream cut across the trail ahead, its banks muddy with fresh prints, though Emily didn't notice. Her music played softly, her breath steady as she stepped across a downed log. 100 feet away, hidden behind a curtain of young spruce, a large male grizzly was foraging for roots and early berries. The bear had not heard her. The breeze was faint and didn't carry her scent. Emily kept walking, focused on her path and lost in the music. When she stepped into the clearing and turned slightly toward the bear's side, the animal lifted its head sharply, its ears flattened. Its massive body went still. For a full second, neither of them moved. Then the bear charged. Emily didn't see it until it was almost on her. A rustle in the brush became a crashing sound, a blur of fur and muscle hurtling forward with terrifying speed. She ripped the headphones from her ears as the growl hit her like thunder. Her body froze. The bear was seconds away. Her instincts took over. She flung her backpack sideways and threw herself to the ground, arms over her neck, legs splayed. She lay still. Her heart raced so hard it hurt, but she didn't move. The grizzly slammed into her pack first, scattering gear and snapping a water bottle in half with its jaws. Then it turned to her. Its massive paws circled her back. Claws raked down her shoulder blades, slicing through her jacket and skin. She felt fire streak through her upper back as blood seeped into the earth. Then teeth found her thigh. The bear bit down hard, lifting her slightly, shaking her once. Her scream remained trapped in her throat. She fought to stay limp. The pain was all-consuming, like being crushed and sliced at once. Her breath stuttered, but she didn't scream. She didn't fight. It dropped her, huffed loudly, then raked her leg again with a paw. Another bite caught her ribs, tearing through flesh and pressing bone. Her vision blurred. Every part of her body begged to run, to roll away, but she didn't. She stayed limp, trying to convince the bear she was no longer a threat. The attack stretched into long, agonizing minutes. The bear circled, sniffed her body, and pawed at her backpack again. Her blood was everywhere. She heard nothing but the thundering beat of her heart, and the bear's snorting breath just inches from her. Then it stopped. She dared not lift her head, but could hear it walking away. Slow, heavy steps, cracking twigs. It paused once, grunted, and then the sound of movement faded into the trees. She lay still, even after silence returned. Only when she was sure the bear was gone did she lift her head, shaking, covered in blood. Her right leg was mangled. Deep punctures marked her upper arm and ribs. Her jacket was soaked through. She couldn't move without searing pain. One side of her chest felt caved in, a fracture, maybe several. She didn't have the strength to reach for her phone, and the nearest signal was miles away. Unused bear spray lay spilled near the stream, and her whistle was broken. She pressed her head into the dirt, fighting to stay conscious. The morning sun passed overhead. The heat crept in. Hours dragged by. Birds returned to the trees. A squirrel darted near her, then fled. At some point, her breathing slowed to shallow gasps. She drifted in and out, fading. It wasn't until early afternoon that a pair of backcountry rangers, rerouted after spotting her car alone at the trailhead, found her lying near the stream. One of them vomited at the sight of her wounds. The other radioed for air support. The helicopter landed 30 minutes later. Medics loaded her in, stabilizing her with IV fluids and oxygen. She was barely conscious but alive. Surgeons at a trauma center in Bozeman spent hours reconstructing her leg and cleaning the wounds. Her rib fractures were serious, but her lung hadn't collapsed. Her thigh required a metal rod. Her back would be scarred, but the damage to her spine had spared her mobility. The attack shocked everyone who heard about it. Photos of her torn backpack and shredded jacket circulated among park rangers and hikers. Officials used the incident to renew warnings across the national park and beyond. Do not hike silently. Do not wear headphones. Make noise. And let bears know you're coming. Emily survived, but everything changed. The trails that had once brought her peace now brought memories of teeth and claws, the moment of impact, and the unbearable silence before the roar. She no longer hiked alone. She kept the shredded jacket as a reminder, the scars beneath it now part of her story. She had come for solitude. Instead, she found a brutal reminder. Silence is not safety in bear country. It's a gamble. The early morning fog clung thickly over the pine-lined outskirts of Clearwater, a small Montana town nestled at the edge of wilderness. The quiet streets held a fragile calm, but that morning, tension hung invisible in the air. Two police officers, Daniels and Martinez, patrolled the area on routine duty, their sharp eyes scanning the edge where forest met suburb. Calls reported a massive grizzly bear roaming dangerously close to homes, knocking over trash bins and frightening residents. The officers had been trained for wildlife encounters, but nothing could fully prepare them for the moment that was about to unfold. Officer Daniels was 42, a seasoned lawman with years of experience in the rugged rural county. He carried himself with a steady confidence, familiar with the dangers lurking just beyond the tree line. Martinez, his partner, was younger, 35, with quick reflexes and a fierce determination to protect the community. Both men understood the risks of patrolling near bear country, especially in spring and early summer, when the animals wandered widely seeking food. They drove slowly down a gravel road, flanked by dense evergreens and scattered cabins. The smell of damp earth and pine filled the air, and birds called softly above. The officers knew the bear was close. Large paw prints and claw marks on trees marked the beast's recent path. As their patrol car rolled to a stop near the edge of a wooded area, both officers stepped out, their boots crunching on gravel. Their eyes scanned the shadows. Suddenly, without warning, a massive shape burst from the underbrush, a towering grizzly, its thick brown fur mottled and soaked with dew. The bear's eyes burned with wild fury, teeth bared, muscles rippling beneath its heavy frame. The charge came swiftly and brutally. Daniels barely had time to react. He reached for his taser and fired, the electric probe shooting toward the bear's chest. But the device seemed useless against the thick hide and raw power barreling toward him. The bear barely flinched. The grizzly slammed into Daniels with a deafening roar, knocking him backward. Pain exploded in his left arm as the bear's massive jaws clamped down, teeth sinking deep through fabric and flesh. Blood spurted, warm and sticky. Daniels screamed silently, his vision narrowing to red rings as the animal shook him violently. Martinez shouted a warning and drew his weapon, but it was not a gun. It was the bear spray, a last-ditch deterrent meant to repel but not kill. The bear swiped at Martinez, knocking him to the ground with a crushing blow. Rocks and dirt sprayed as the smaller officer tried to shield himself, his heart pounding. The bear's claws raked across his back, tearing through jacket and skin. Despite their injuries, the officers fought back with everything they had. Daniels, blood pouring from his arm, struggled to free himself from the bear's powerful grip. He grabbed Martinez's bear spray with desperate strength and fired a cloud of noxious spray directly into the bear's snarling face. The bear staggered back, coughing and pawing at its eyes. The sharp, burning spray pierced the animal's sensitive nose and eyes, breaking its relentless assault. Seizing the moment, Martinez scrambled to his feet, grabbing the second canister and unleashing a thick mist into the beast's open mouth and eyes. The grizzly roared in pain and fury, but began to retreat, limping awkwardly toward the shadowed woods. Blood dripped from its snout and clawed eyes, but it was alive and angry. The officers collapsed onto the gravel road, gasping for air and soaked in their blood. Daniel's left arm was mangled, with deep puncture wounds and crushed muscles. Martinez's back and ribs throbbed painfully, torn but intact. Within minutes, emergency medical teams arrived, alerted by frantic calls from nearby residents. Paramedics rushed to stabilize the men, applying pressure bandages to stop the bleeding and administering oxygen to ease their shallow breaths. A helicopter stood ready on a makeshift landing zone nearby, its rotors chopping through the tense morning air. The men were airlifted to the nearest hospital in Helena, Montana, where surgeons worked for hours to repair nerve damage, stop internal bleeding, and mend shattered bones. Both officers survived the attack but faced long, grueling recoveries. Daniels would need months of physical therapy to regain full use of his arm, while Martinez battled severe bruising and broken ribs that left him breathless for weeks. The attack sent shockwaves through the community and law enforcement agencies. Questions arose immediately about how such a dangerous encounter could occur so close to a town's edge, and whether police officers were adequately prepared for wildlife confrontations in areas where bears roamed freely. The taser's failure and the reliance on bear spray sparked fierce debate about police equipment standards and training. Wildlife experts and conservationists weighed in, reminding the public that grizzly bears were a protected species vital to the region's ecosystem, but could be deadly when threatened or cornered. They warned that expanding human settlements into bear habitats increased the risk of dangerous encounters, especially as bears followed food sources into populated areas. Authorities launched a review of bear management policies around Clearwater and similar towns. They looked at better community education on avoiding attractants like unsecured garbage and outdoor pet food. They also considered enhanced patrols, public alerts, and improved emergency response protocols. The incident was a brutal reminder of the wildness lurking beyond the human footprint for Daniels and Martinez. The attack left scars deeper than those visible on their bodies. Both men carried that day's weight in quiet reflection, knowing they had survived a fight few ever faced and lived to tell the tale. Their courage and quick thinking saved each other's lives, and their ordeal became a stark warning to others about the fine line between man and nature in Montana's wilderness. The grizzly bear, powerful and untamed, remained a force of nature that no human weapon could fully control. Only respect and caution might keep such deadly meetings rare. The Montana backcountry was a vast wilderness of towering pines, rocky ridges, and wide meadows bathed in late afternoon sunlight. Hunter Paul had been out for days tracking elk across this rugged land. He was a man in his early 40s, experienced and self-reliant, with a passion for the outdoors that had shaped his life since youth. That morning, his patience had paid off. A clean shot had brought down a large bull elk, and Paul had felt a deep satisfaction as he prepared to process the animal. As evening crept in, Paul set up camp in a small clearing near a creek, surrounded by thick forest. He hung some gear from a tree, but made a critical error. The elk carcass was left partially exposed on the ground near his tent. Fatigue and excitement dulled his caution. The crisp mountain air carried the rich scent of blood and meat, an irresistible lure to the local wildlife, especially the grizzlies known to roam these parts. Night fell quickly. The stars glittered overhead, and the forest grew silent except for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Paul lay inside his tent, exhausted and satisfied. Outside, hidden in the shadows beyond the firelight, a massive grizzly stirred, drawn by the smell of the fresh kill. The bear moved cautiously at first, sniffing the air with powerful nostrils, eyes reflecting moonlight. Hunger gnawed at it fiercely, and the scent of elk was a feast it could not ignore. The grizzly approached the camp silently, muscles rippling beneath thick fur, its heavy paws making little sound on the soft earth. Suddenly, Paul's dog, tethered nearby, began to bark sharply, breaking the quiet. The bear froze for a moment, then surged forward with terrifying speed. Paul rushed out of his tent, heart pounding, grabbing a flashlight and his hunting knife. He shouted and waved his arms, pounding the ground and yelling to scare the animal away. The grizzly reared back for an instant, then charged, its roar shattering the night like thunder. The first attack was brutal. The bear swiped with one massive paw, slamming Paul into the dirt with bone-crushing force. Pain exploded through his ribs, a sharp crack echoing inside his chest. The grizzly's jaws snapped near his arm, biting down with savage strength and tearing flesh. Blood poured freely as Paul struggled to fight back. Despite the fear and pain, Paul's instincts kicked in. He thrust his knife toward the bear's face, aiming for the sensitive eyes. The blade found its mark, eliciting a howl of rage from the beast. The grizzly shook violently, then lunged again. Paul used his boots as weapons, kicking fiercely at the bear's snout and sides. Each strike was desperate, meant to create space and slow the predator. He was no match for the grizzly's strength, but he knew that giving in meant certain death. The struggle raged on for minutes that felt like hours. The forest around them was silent, except for the clash of man and beast. Growls, snarls, grunts of pain, and the harsh sounds of Paul gasping for air. Finally, the bear, wounded and frustrated by Paul's resistance, pulled back, growling low, but retreating into the trees. Paul lay on the ground, bleeding heavily, ribs aching with every breath, limbs trembling. Pain threatened to overwhelm him, but survival drove him onward. He crawled back to his camp, reached his radio, and sent a faint distress signal. His voice was weak but urgent, and he hoped rescue teams would find him before darkness swallowed the forest completely. The night was long and cold. Paul used the last of his strength to tend to his wounds, wrapping torn clothes around deep cuts to slow bleeding. The sound of distant sirens and searching voices finally reached his ears just before dawn. Rescue crews arrived, carefully carrying Paul on a stretcher through the rugged terrain to a waiting helicopter. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly to repair shattered ribs, deep bite wounds, and punctures that had nearly reached vital organs. Though the injuries were severe, Paul was expected to survive. The attack left a permanent mark on him, not just physical scars, but a haunting memory of how quickly danger could erupt in the wilderness. It was a stark lesson in respect for the power of nature and the importance of caution. Wildlife officials used Paul's story to emphasize the dangers of improper carcass and food storage in bear country. They urged hunters and campers to follow strict protocols, secure meat in bear-proof containers, hang carcasses high and far from campsites, and always be aware of local wildlife activity. The incident was a harsh reminder that one small mistake could turn a rewarding hunt into a desperate fight for survival in the wild. The grizzly bear, a magnificent but deadly guardian of the Montana wilderness, had exacted a fierce revenge, teaching a lesson that would resonate for years. The autumn of 2017, vibrant fall foliage in a popular mountainous region of the southeastern United States drew thousands of hikers eager to witness nature's annual color display before winter set in. This ancient mountain range, spanning the border between two southern states, is home to some of North America's most diverse forest ecosystems and a stable population of American black bears. Among the many visitors that October was Thaddeus Blackwood, a 34-year-old software engineer from Charlotte who had recently rekindled a childhood passion for hiking. After completing several marked trails during the summer, Thaddeus felt confident enough to attempt what locals referred to as ridge chasing, a practice of seeking out ideal sunset vantage points that often required short detours off official paths. The day began without incident. Thaddeus arrived at the trailhead before dawn, his backpack stocked with energy snacks, water, a basic first aid kit, and a small canister of bear spray, a precaution he had rarely considered essential in the past. His plan was to follow a major trail for 6 miles before veering off toward a wooded ridge to reach a scenic outcropping he had marked on a topographic map. Officials later confirmed that Thaddeus had signed the trail register and outlined his intended route, although he had not disclosed plans to leave the designated path. By mid-afternoon, he had made good progress and entered a particularly dense section of forest to reach his chosen overlook before sunset. What Thaddeus could not have known was that he had stepped into a seasonal feeding area for a black bear. The bear, a female estimated to weigh around 250 pounds, had been foraging heavily on acorns and berries to prepare for winter hibernation. Biologists later concluded that the bear had likely made a temporary bedding site beneath a fallen oak near where Thaddeus intended to exit the woods. According to the account he later gave to authorities, Thaddeus was pushing through a thick stand of mountain laurel when he heard a sudden snort followed by movement in the leaves. Within moments, A bear charged from approximately 15 yards away. The impact knocked him backward down a small incline. Thaddeus described a sharp pain as the bear's teeth punctured his upper thigh. Instinctively, he began screaming and swinging his trekking poles, striking the bear across the face. This sudden resistance appeared to disorient the animal momentarily, allowing Thaddeus to roll into a narrow gap between two large boulders. The bear attempted to reach him but was unable to fit through the confined space. After several minutes of circling and audible huffing, the sow retreated into the brush, although Thaddeus could still hear it moving nearby for what felt like hours. Sheltered in his rocky refuge, Thaddeus Blackwood took stock of his injuries. The puncture wounds in his thigh were deep and bleeding heavily. He removed his shirt, folded it into a compress, and used his belt to hold it firmly against the wound. By then, symptoms of shock had begun to set in, and he realized his cell phone showed no signal, an all-too-common issue in the remote valleys of the region. As twilight descended over the mountains, the temperature dropped sharply, intensifying his physical distress. Believing he might not survive the night, Thaddeus retrieved his trail journal from his backpack and wrote what he thought could be his final message. He included a note to his mother, added the date, and recorded his coordinates from the GPS device before carefully placing the journal back into his pack. Help came from an unexpected source. Marianne Lefebvre, an experienced backcountry guide, had been leading a small group along a nearby trail when one of her clients reported hearing unusual sounds. Recognizing the noises as possible distress calls, Marianne followed wilderness protocol. She instructed her assistant to lead the group to their designated campsite while she went to investigate. She discovered Thaddeus shortly after 8 p.m., semi-conscious and in an advanced state of hypothermia. Marianne immediately activated her emergency beacon and provided wilderness first aid, using thermal blankets and heat packs to stabilize his core temperature. The area's emergency response team, already mobilized after Thaddeus failed to return to his vehicle by nightfall, arrived by helicopter 3 hours later. At a regional trauma center, surgeons operated for 5 hours to repair the damage to his thigh, which had narrowly missed a major artery. Medical staff confirmed that had the field compress not been applied when it was, Thaddeus would have likely succumbed to blood loss before rescue. Following an investigation, wildlife officials determined the bear had acted defensively when startled at close range. It was neither relocated nor tracked further, and the incident was classified as a rare and unfortunate wilderness encounter rather than a predatory attack. During his 3-month recovery, the message Thaddeus had written in his journal gained widespread attention among outdoor enthusiasts. His words were shared as a poignant reminder of how quickly adventure in the wild can turn perilous. The phrase he had written, his farewell to his mother, was later incorporated into public safety campaigns about the risks of venturing off established trails. Thaddeus returned to hiking the following year, but never alone again. He became a vocal advocate for wilderness safety, especially regarding behavior in bear country. In interviews, he often emphasized that the bear had not been at fault. It had been defending its space. The outcome, he maintained, stemmed from his own choice to leave the marked trail. As a result of the incident, park officials introduced new signage at trailheads, warning about the increased risk of off-trail hiking during the fall season, when bears are actively preparing for hibernation. These education efforts were credited with reducing similar incidents by nearly 40% in the following years. In the summer of 2008, the remote southwestern shores of Kodiak Island, Alaska, remained one of the last truly wild coastlines in North America. Part of the sprawling Kodiak Wildlife Refuge, established in 1941, the island was home to the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world, the Kodiak bear. These massive carnivores, sometimes exceeding 1,500 pounds, roamed the island's varied terrain of mountains, meadows, and densely forested valleys, with little human interference. Percival Percy Harrington Wells had made a name for himself as one of wildlife photography's most daring and dedicated practitioners. At 46, The British-born, Seattle-based photographer had published acclaimed photo essays in prominent magazines and renowned wildlife publications. His signature approach involved immersing himself alone in wilderness areas for weeks at a time to capture intimate moments of animal behavior that few humans had ever witnessed. Percy's latest project aimed to document the feeding patterns of Kodiak bears during the summer salmon runs, specifically the subtle differences in fishing techniques employed by bears of varying ages and sexes. After securing the necessary permits from wildlife authorities, he chartered a small float plane to drop him off at a secluded cove on the island's southwestern shore, a location known for its healthy bear population, but seldom visited due to its inaccessibility. The pilot who delivered Percy to the site later recalled warning him about the unusual number of bears he had spotted during the approach flight. Percy, however, reportedly dismissed these concerns, pointing to his 20 years of experience working around large predators and the extensive safety equipment he had with him, including motion sensor cameras designed to alert him to approaching animals. For 3 days, Percy established his base camp on a small, rocky beach at the cove's edge. He set up remote cameras along a nearby salmon stream and began collecting preliminary footage. His satellite phone communications with his editor in Seattle indicated initial success, with Percy reporting he had observed at least 7 different bears utilizing the stream and surrounding area. On the 4th day, Percy decided to venture further inland to place additional cameras at locations where bears might be resting between feeding sessions. According to the data later recovered from his GPS device, he hiked approximately 3 miles up a densely wooded valley alongside the stream. The timestamps on his camera indicated he had spent several hours setting up motion-triggered equipment in a small clearing, where bear tracks and scat suggested frequent animal activity. What Percy could not have known was that he had entered the territory of a particularly large male Kodiak bear, estimated by wildlife biologists to weigh close to 1,400 pounds. The bear had recently killed a young moose calf and dragged the carcass into a thicket near the clearing where Percy was working. Evidence suggested the bear had been away from its kill temporarily, possibly forced off by wolves or another bear, and was returning when it encountered the photographer. At approximately 4:40 p.m., Percy's body-mounted camera captured the bear, observing him from the forest edge for nearly 2 minutes before making its presence known. The footage, later recovered by search and rescue personnel, showed the moment when Percy, sensing he was being watched, turned to find himself less than 30 yards from the massive predator. Unlike many bear encounters, where the animal might make a bluff charge or display defensive behavior, this bear launched into an immediate full attack. Wildlife experts who later reviewed the footage noted that the bear's body language indicated clear predatory intent rather than defensive aggression, a crucial distinction that likely determined the outcome of the encounter. Percy attempted to deploy his bear spray, but the animal closed the distance too quickly. The camera recorded the bear striking him with a powerful swipe from its front paw, sending him crashing into a fallen log. The impact caused severe trauma to Percy's skull and left deep lacerations across his face and neck. The camera continued recording for several more seconds, capturing the bear mauling him, focusing primarily on his head and upper body, behavior indicative of a predatory attack rather than a defensive one. In what park rangers later described as an extraordinary stroke of both misfortune and fortune, Percy had positioned himself directly between the bear and its cached kill. Had it not been for Percy's decision to employ the last resort survival technique of playing dead, either intentionally or due to losing consciousness, the attack might have continued to its fatal conclusion. The footage showed the bear standing over Percy's motionless form for nearly a minute before it turned away toward its original kill site. Despite suffering catastrophic injuries, Percy regained consciousness approximately an hour later. Blood loss and trauma had sent him into shock, but he managed to activate his emergency satellite beacon before losing consciousness again. The International Emergency Response Center that received the distress signal immediately alerted Alaska wildlife troopers and the Coast Guard. A rescue helicopter located Percy's position shortly after dawn the following day. First responders found him barely alive, having survived the night despite temperatures dropping into the low 40s. Percy had suffered a fractured skull, a broken jaw, severed facial nerves, partial scalping, and deep puncture wounds to his shoulders and chest. Medical professionals later stated that his heavy camera backpack had likely protected his spine from being crushed by the bear's bite. After being airlifted to Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center and later transferred to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, Percy underwent 11 surgeries over the course of 9 months. He lost sight in his right eye and experienced permanent nerve damage, which affected his facial expressions and fine motor control in his hands. The bear was not pursued or euthanized, as wildlife officials determined it had been behaving naturally, defending a food resource within its territory. The area where the attack occurred was temporarily closed to human activity, but it was reopened the following season with enhanced warning signage about bear activity. Against all medical expectations, Percy returned to photography 18 months after the attack, though he never again worked alone in bear country. His photo essay about the experience, titled The Predator's Gaze, won multiple international awards and became a cornerstone resource in wildlife safety education. When interviewed years later about why he had chosen to continue his career after such trauma, Percy explained that his near-death experience had given him a deeper appreciation for the true nature of wild animals, not as the anthropomorphized creatures often portrayed in the media, but as powerful beings operating according to ancient imperatives of survival. Of 2019, the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York displayed their legendary fall colors, drawing thousands of visitors to experience the region's spectacular natural beauty. Established as a protected Forever Wild area in 1892, the Adirondack Park encompassed 6 million acres of forests, lakes, and mountains, the largest publicly protected area in the contiguous United States. While much of the park had developed tourist infrastructure, substantial portions remained genuine wilderness, home to healthy populations of black bears that had grown increasingly habituated to human presence over decades of conservation management. Zachariah Pemberton and Valencia Orozco Pemberton had chosen the Adirondacks to celebrate their 5th wedding anniversary. The couple from Boston, he a software developer and she a pediatric nurse, had met during college volunteer work, building hiking trails in these very mountains. Returning to the region held special significance for them, and they had splurged on renting a luxury cabin near Long Lake, approximately 30 miles from the nearest sizable town. Whispering Pines Retreat sat on 3 private acres bordering state forest land, advertised online as offering authentic wilderness seclusion with modern amenities. The A-frame structure featured panoramic windows overlooking a serene pond, a spacious deck with outdoor grilling facilities, and rustic chic decor that matched the couple's aesthetic preferences perfectly. What the listing failed to mention was the property's history of wildlife encounters, specifically the increasing frequency of bear sightings in the area over the previous 2 years. The Pembertons arrived at the cabin on October 12th, delighted to find it even more charming than the photographs suggested. They spent their first day hiking nearby trails and returned exhausted but satisfied to prepare a celebratory anniversary dinner. Valencia had brought special ingredients for grilling steaks and vegetables on the deck's elaborate barbecue setup, and the couple enjoyed their meal as twilight descended over the pond. Environmental conservation officers would later determine that several critical errors occurred that evening. The Pembertons, though environmentally conscious, were urban dwellers unfamiliar with proper food management in bear country. They had cleaned the grill only superficially after cooking, leaving substantial grease and food residue on the grates and in the drip pan. Additionally, they had disposed of food scraps in an ordinary kitchen trash can inside the cabin, rather than using the bear-resistant container provided in a separate utility shed, a detail mentioned only briefly in the back pages of the cabin's information binder. According to Valencia's subsequent account to authorities, the couple had retired around 10:30 p.m. after enjoying wine by the fireplace. The bedroom was located on the cabin's second-floor loft, while the kitchen and living area occupied the open-concept main floor below. At approximately 2:15 a.m., they were awakened by what Zachariah initially assumed was a raccoon or squirrel rummaging through the kitchen. When the sounds of breaking glass and clattering metal intensified, Zachariah decided to investigate. Valencia reported that she had urged him to stay in the bedroom, but he had insisted on checking, taking only his phone as a flashlight. From the loft railing, he shone the light down into the kitchen area and found himself face to face with a medium-sized black bear that had entered through a window the couple had left partially open for fresh air. The bear, estimated by wildlife officials to weigh approximately 250 pounds, had already scattered trash across the kitchen floor and was aggressively exploring the refrigerator contents. Startled by the sudden light, the animal looked up toward Zachariah on the loft and immediately displayed signs of agitation, huffing loudly and swatting at the countertop. Zachariah backed slowly toward the bedroom door, but the bear, perhaps feeling cornered or simply following the food scent, began climbing the wooden staircase to the loft. Valencia recalled hearing Zachariah shout for her to barricade the bedroom door as he tried to divert the bear's attention. She grabbed their suitcases and pushed them against the door while searching frantically for anything that could be used as a weapon. The bear reached the top of the stairs with surprising speed. Valencia heard a heavy thud against the bedroom door, followed by Zachariah's scream of pain. The door frame splintered as the bear forced its way into the room. In the chaos that followed, the animal delivered a powerful blow to Zachariah's chest that knocked him against the wall before turning toward Valencia. In what conservation officers later described as remarkable presence of mind, Valencia remembered the bear spray they had purchased for hiking, still in her backpack from the day's excursion. She lunged for the pack, extracted the canister, and discharged a full blast of the capsaicin-based deterrent directly into the bear's face from approximately 5 feet away. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The bear recoiled, pawing frantically at its eyes and snout while emitting distressed vocalizations. It retreated blindly, tumbling partly down the staircase before regaining its balance and crashing back through the kitchen and out the broken window. Valencia found Zachariah conscious but seriously injured, with deep lacerations across his chest and a compound fracture to his left arm where the bear's claws had torn through muscle and bone. The cabin's landline had been damaged during the bear's rampage, and cell service was non-existent in the remote location. Valencia applied pressure dressings to Zachariah's wounds using clean clothing and helped him to their vehicle. The nearest hospital was 45 minutes away along dark, winding mountain roads. Valencia later recalled that Zachariah remained conscious throughout most of the drive, going into shock only as they pulled into the emergency department parking lot around 3:30 a.m. Medical personnel stabilized him before transferring him to a trauma center in Albany, where he underwent 7 hours of surgery to repair nerve and tissue damage. By remarkable coincidence, the couple was spotted driving toward the hospital by a local fisherman, Marcus Adirondack, who was heading out for early morning fishing. Noticing their erratic driving and hazard lights, he followed them to the hospital and then used his local knowledge to guide authorities back to the cabin site, where environmental conservation officers documented the scene and set traps for the bear. The animal was captured 2 days later, still in the vicinity of the cabin and attempting to access another vacation property's unsecured trash. Following state protocol for bears that have injured humans, officials euthanized and examined the animal. The necropsy revealed the bear was a healthy 4-year-old male with no signs of disease or injury that might have explained unusual aggression. Its stomach contents included numerous food items consistent with human garbage, evidence of previous successful raids on unsecured trash. The incident prompted the Essex County Board of Supervisors to implement stricter regulations for vacation rental properties in bear habitat, requiring owners to install bear-resistant trash containers and provide prominent safety information to guests. The New York Department of Environmental Conservation also initiated an expanded public education campaign about proper food storage in the Adirondack region. Zachariah Pemberton recovered after months of physical therapy, though with permanent nerve damage affecting grip strength in his left hand. The couple founded Bear Smart Adirondacks, a non-profit organization dedicated to reducing human-bear conflicts through education and improved waste management infrastructure throughout the park. Their anniversary tradition continued, though they now chose locations with fewer large carnivores, and they became meticulous about securing food and trash whenever they ventured into bear country. Piatra Neamt, Romania, October 12, 2018. The Carpathian Mountains, stretching across Eastern Europe like an ancient spine, have long been a source of mineral wealth. For centuries, these rugged peaks were mined for salt, silver, and gold, leaving behind a vast hidden network of tunnels, shafts, and chambers beneath the forest floor. Near the scenic Romanian town of Piatra Neamt, many of these subterranean structures remain buried under layers of moss and silence, relics of long-forgotten industry. Among those captivated by these spaces was Dr. Matei Antonescu, a seasoned speleologist working with a leading geological research institute. Over a 15-year career, Antonescu had earned respect for his meticulous cave surveys and ecological fieldwork across the Eastern Carpathians. At 47, he remained deeply dedicated to exploring remote environments, often alone. In the fall of 2018, his attention turned to a rarely documented 19th-century silver mine carved during the Austro-Hungarian period. Located in a remote sector of the mountains, the site had seen little human presence in decades. Antonescu hoped to map its internal layout and assess its potential for future ecological research before winter snows made access impossible. That October brought an earlier-than-expected seasonal shift. Cold air swept down from the peaks, and wildlife had already begun retreating into dens. On the morning of the 12th, under overcast skies, Antonescu left his temporary field camp and set off toward the site. His assistant had returned to the capital 2 days prior for personal reasons, but rather than postpone the trip, Antonescu pressed on alone, something he had done many times before. With basic survival gear and layered clothing, he navigated a forest trail until reaching the mine entrance. Hidden by fallen branches and thick undergrowth, the entrance required minor clearing. Once inside, the air was cool and damp, filled with the sharp scent of stone. But something else lingered, a musty animal scent that made him pause. Still, he continued forward. Activating his headlamp, Antonescu documented his surroundings as he advanced into the mine. The main tunnel sloped gently downward, its timber supports surprisingly intact. After about 40 meters, the passage split into 3 smaller corridors. Following procedure, he marked his position and selected the center tunnel for initial exploration. As he progressed, the space narrowed. Soon he was crawling through a constricted shaft, the sounds of his movement, boots scraping, gear brushing rock, amplified by the close walls. Unknown to him, these noises were disturbing something further below. The warning came suddenly. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the tunnel. Antonescu froze, then slowly raised his headlamp. About 10 meters ahead, just past where the tunnel widened again, 2 amber-colored eyes reflected in his beam, eyes fixed on him from a massive shape in the darkness. A Carpathian brown bear, a large, solitary male estimated later to weigh nearly 300 kilograms, had taken refuge in the mine. It had likely selected the shaft as an early denning site, retreating from the approaching cold and encroaching human activity in the surrounding forest. Feeling cornered and defensive, the bear charged. Antonescu scrambled backward, slipping on the slick floor. One of the animal's swipes tore through his clothing and left a deep injury to his left shoulder, slamming him into the rock wall. Despite the pain, he remained conscious. In the confusion, he spotted a narrow crevice formed by a collapsed beam and wedged himself tightly into the gap, just wide enough to keep the bear from reaching him directly. For 6 hours, he remained there, wounded, silent, and motionless. The bear did not immediately leave. It paced nearby, growling intermittently and occasionally swiping at the rock barrier. The confined space amplified every sound. Blood from his injury soaked into his clothing, and the cold air inside the mine began draining his strength. His phone, tucked in his pack, was unusable. The rock above blocked any signal. As dusk approached and the forest outside began to darken, The bear eventually withdrew deeper into the mine. Still, Antonescu waited another hour before daring to move. Slowly and with great effort, he crawled out of the narrow space and began retracing his steps through the tunnel. Every movement deliberate, every sound weighed against the possibility of triggering another response. By the time he reached the forest outside, night had nearly fallen. Exhausted, cold, and in pain, he made his way to his vehicle and drove to the nearest settlement. Local residents quickly recognized the seriousness of his injuries. An experienced physician provided initial treatment before arranging transfer to a hospital in the nearest city. Investigations later confirmed a broader trend. Brown bears across the Carpathians had increasingly begun using abandoned human-made structures, like old mines and cellars, for shelter. As logging and development disrupted their natural habitats, bears adapted by seeking isolated and quiet spaces underground. Wildlife authorities reviewed the incident and determined the bear had responded instinctively to a perceived threat in its temporary shelter. No further action was taken against the animal. Though Antonescu's physical recovery was swift, the psychological effects took longer to fade. When he returned to the field, he implemented strict new protocols. Remote camera probes were deployed before entering any cave or tunnel, and all expeditions, regardless of familiarity with the site, were done with at least one additional team member. His account of the event, later published in a scientific journal, played a key role in updating national safety guidelines for researchers and conservationists working in bear habitats. The old mine has remained undisturbed since, its shadowed corridors unofficially returned to the wilderness that reclaimed them. Today, Antonescu continues his work with a renewed sense of caution and respect for the unpredictable world beneath the forest floor. His experience is now required reading for new field researchers, serving as a powerful reminder that even the most experienced professionals are never truly alone in the wild. Cassiar Highway, British Columbia, July 8, 2016. Cutting through some of North America's most remote terrain, the Cassiar Highway stretches for 874 kilometers across northern British Columbia, linking it to the Yukon. For much of its route, the two-lane road traverses an immense wilderness. Forested ridgelines, alpine passes, and long, empty valleys where cell coverage vanishes and traffic is a rare occurrence. 42-year-old Emmett Hollingsworth knew this stretch well. A seasoned tradesman, he had worked throughout the northern industrial circuits for over a decade and understood the challenges of traveling through the backcountry. But this trip was different. His 12-year-old daughter Zephyr was with him, visiting his worksite during her summer break. That year, the region was experiencing unseasonably high temperatures. Days climbed above 30 degrees Celsius, even at elevation, and wildlife biologists later noted behavioral shifts among native species. Grizzly bears, in particular, had been sighted in unfamiliar areas, drawn by water sources, roadkill, or in some cases, the smell of food left by passing travelers. Roughly 320 kilometers north of the nearest settlement, with no services for hours in either direction, Emmett's truck began to overheat. Steam rose from the hood. A quick inspection revealed a split radiator hose, a relatively minor failure under normal conditions, but a serious one this far from assistance. There was no phone reception and traffic was sparse. They had seen only 2 other vehicles that day. Emmett began unloading supplies to locate his emergency repair kit. 2 coolers were set aside, one containing perishable food, and bags and camping gear were moved from the cab. As he searched, neither he nor Zephyr noticed the grizzly bear until it emerged silently from the tree line, just off the road behind them. The bear, later identified through tracks and analysis as a mature male weighing approximately 280 kilograms, was likely drawn by the scent of food. It stood at the forest's edge, head high, testing the air. Zephyr spotted it first. Her sudden reaction drew Emmett's attention. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted. Staying calm, he instructed his daughter to slowly retreat toward the truck. He attempted to deter the bear by making himself appear larger, waving his arms, shouting, tossing small rocks into the nearby brush. These gestures gave the bear a momentary pause, but they weren't enough to turn it away. Its attention was locked on the open cooler. As the bear began to approach, Emmett knew the priority was safety. He helped Zephyr climb onto the roof of the pickup truck, following quickly behind. From this vantage point, they remained visible but out of immediate reach. What followed was nearly 50 minutes of tense observation. The bear moved with deliberate ease, using its powerful limbs to tear open the cooler. scatter food across the gravel, and crush containers with little effort. It showed minimal interest in the humans watching from above, acknowledging them occasionally with a glance, but never directly threatening them. The midday heat posed a different danger. The sun beat down on the metal roof of the vehicle, quickly turning it into a scorching surface. Zephyr's skin began to redden and blister in places. Emmett gave her his shirt, using it to create a thin barrier between her and the hot metal. Still, the discomfort grew with every passing minute. Eventually, a camper van appeared on the road, heading north. Emmett signaled urgently. The vehicle slowed. Its driver, Reginald Pearson, a retired wilderness ranger, immediately understood the situation. He used the van's horn repeatedly, creating enough noise to unsettle the bear. After a final glance, the animal began to retreat. Not hurriedly, but with the same steady confidence it had shown throughout. It disappeared into the trees. Pearson provided first aid for Zephyr's minor burns and shared water and supplies. Drawing on his experience, he helped Emmett fashion a temporary fix using duct tape and a section of hose from his own vehicle. He then escorted the truck for the remaining 80 kilometers to the nearest fuel stop to ensure they reached safety. Wildlife authorities later reviewed the incident and found that the bear had behaved naturally, drawn by accessible food, not aggression. The site was added to a list of locations for updated safety signage, reminding travelers to secure all food and waste properly, even in areas where bear sightings are infrequent. For Zephyr, the event left more than physical marks. In the weeks that followed, she struggled with sleep and developed anxiety around animal sounds. Even benign wilderness audio, like wind in the trees or a crackling campfire, could spark moments of fear. With counseling and support, she gradually regained confidence. Over time, her experience became a source of strength. She began volunteering with local conservation groups and eventually speaking to youth programs about coexisting with wildlife. Her presentations emphasized preparation, awareness, and respect, not fear. Photographs from that day, captured by Pearson, were later used in public education materials. The story resonated across the province, not as a tale of survival, but as a call for responsibility in shared landscapes. Emmett, when asked in a later interview what he remembered most, didn't speak of the fear or the damage. Instead, he described the bear's quiet presence. What endured most for the Hollingsworths wasn't the destruction or the fear. It was a shift in perspective. The bear had moved with calm assurance, unhurried and unafraid, as if the land itself recognized it. In that moment, it was clear. This was its territory, not theirs. A protected wilderness area in Alaska, August 17, 2013. A remote river in this vast region has long been known as one of the world's premier places to witness brown bears during the salmon run. Each summer, as sockeye salmon return to their ancestral spawning grounds, dozens of massive grizzly bears gather along the river's edge, creating one of the most breathtaking natural spectacles in North America. For wildlife photographers and adventurers alike, watching these powerful animals deftly pull fish from the rushing current offers a quintessential experience of Alaska's wild spirit. For Nathaniel Blackburn, a 44-year-old commercial fisherman from Kodiak Island, this river symbolized more than a photographic opportunity. It was a living laboratory, a place where he could study the behavior of wild salmon and perhaps gain insight into the dwindling salmon returns that had increasingly threatened his livelihood. With specialized permission from land management authorities, Blackburn set up a small temporary research outpost approximately 2 kilometers upstream from the river's more famous waterfall viewing area, a part of the watershed rarely frequented by tourists. The summer of 2013 brought an exceptional surge of salmon to the region. Biologists recorded the highest sockeye return in over 10 years, and the watershed teemed with activity. The abundance of fish, however, also drew in an unusually large number of grizzly bears. Wildlife monitors documented nearly 60 different bears that season, almost twice the average count for that area. On a cool August morning, Blackburn waded into the thigh-deep river to check underwater netting designed to briefly trap salmon for sampling and measurement before their release. His gear was technical and his methods precise, aimed at minimizing disturbance to the riverbed. His research site had been chosen for its relative isolation and safety. Flanked by steep canyon walls and featuring limited access points, the location allowed clear views in both directions. In previous weeks, he had only encountered bears at a distance. But nature is unpredictable. That morning, midway through a routine river crossing, Blackburn heard the unmistakable crack of breaking branches from the upstream forest. A massive male grizzly bear, later identified by field monitors as one of the dominant individuals in the area, emerged from the tree line roughly 40 meters away. The bear, estimated at nearly 480 kilograms, was in his physical prime, muscular, alert, and intensely focused. Biologists would later theorize that this particular bear had been displaced from its preferred fishing grounds by younger rivals and was now exploring alternative sites. Blackburn, caught in the middle of the river, had no time to reach either bank safely. With no other viable option, he scrambled onto a partially submerged fallen tree stretching across part of the channel. The log was slick with moss and river spray, offering little grip or comfort. As the cold water swirled around him, he could only watch as the bear entered the water upstream. To his relief, the bear appeared uninterested in his presence. Instead, the animal's attention was fixed on the salmon hovering just behind the submerged log. With swift, deliberate motions, the bear began fishing, its massive paws slicing through the current with remarkable precision. In one clean strike, it snatched a salmon from the water and tossed it onto a nearby boulder. For the next 20 minutes, Blackburn remained completely still, his muscles tensing with fatigue and his soaked gear drawing the chill deeper into his bones. The bear moved methodically, focusing on the task of feeding. Every sense was heightened for Blackburn: the scent of wet fur, the scrape of claws on stone, the subtle changes in current. Each detail etched itself into his memory. Eventually, the bear moved further upstream, vanishing around a curve in the canyon. Still uncertain whether it might return, Blackburn remained motionless on the log for several more minutes. Only when the silence grew long and steady did he descend carefully and make his way to shore, his legs trembling from both the cold and the release of tension. Back at his camp, he reported the encounter to park headquarters via radio. A ranger advised him to relocate his equipment closer to regularly patrolled areas, and noted that this particular bear had recently exhibited increased aggression, possibly due to an injury sustained in a territorial altercation with a younger male. Surveillance photos later showed a visible wound on the bear's shoulder, consistent with such a struggle. Though not life-threatening, the injury may have explained the bear's deviation from more competitive fishing zones. Blackburn finished his research session without further incident and left the area 3 days later. Before departing, he stopped by the ranger station, where staff shared more photos and observations about the bear. The experience left a lasting impression, not of danger, but of humility. In the years that followed, Blackburn returned to salmon research across Alaska. Though he continued his work, he never again conducted field operations alone in bear territory. His findings contributed to improved fishery management in multiple districts, influencing both policy and conservation efforts. During presentations to state officials and fellow researchers, he often opened with the story of that fateful morning, not as a tale of survival, but as a reflection on the delicate balance between human presence and wild ecosystems. He described how, in that frozen moment on the log, he understood something profound. The bear had not perceived him as a threat, a rival, or even as food. He was simply part of the scenery, irrelevant to the bear's purpose. This realization shifted his perspective on nature itself. It wasn't about control or strength. Survival often depended on stillness, observation, and restraint. Blackburn's reflections became central to his educational outreach. He often spoke of the log, not just as a piece of wood, but as a symbol of coexistence. For him, it represented the silent contract between human and wild, a space where fear and respect could coexist without conflict. In every story, he emphasized that stewardship of the natural world must come from a place of reverence, not dominance. Years later, as he continued to work on rivers across the region, Blackburn's thoughts often returned to that canyon, that bear, and that moment of absolute stillness. In a world increasingly shaped by human expansion, his message remained clear. In the wilderness, humility is not a weakness, it is survival. Igor had been a drone pilot for more than a decade, specializing in wildlife surveys and filming rare animals in remote regions. His passion for technology and nature merged in this challenging work, flying advanced drones over vast wilderness areas to capture elusive creatures on camera. On May 18, 2025, deep in the dense forests of Russia's Ussuri Krai, Igor and his assistant Pavel were engaged in their most ambitious project yet, documenting the behavior of the region's grizzly bears, known for their size and aggression. Igor, in his early 40s, was lean and weathered from years spent outdoors. Pavel, a few years younger, was a sharp and cautious observer, responsible for ground support and safety. The two men shared a quiet respect for the wild, fully aware of the risks involved, but committed to collecting valuable data. Their equipment was state-of-the-art. The drone alone had cost Igor a staggering $50,000, an investment justified by the potential scientific value. Over the years, they had tracked elusive wolves, rare leopards, and migratory birds across unforgiving terrain. But this assignment carried unique danger. Grizzlies were unpredictable and territorial, and the dense vegetation offered little visibility or protection. Still, the potential rewards, a detailed study of an apex predator's behavior in its natural habitat, were too great to pass up. That morning, the sky was overcast with heavy clouds, and the air smelled fresh and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. They had set up near a wide riverbank where a large male grizzly had been spotted feeding. The massive bear stood nearly 10 feet tall when upright, its broad shoulders and powerful muscles unmistakable even from a distance. Igor adjusted the drone's controls, fine-tuning the camera to zoom in without disturbing the animal. Pavel stationed himself about 20 meters away, keeping watch over both the bear and Igor. They had agreed on a strict safety protocol. Never approach the bear on foot, keep the drone at a safe altitude, and remain ready to retreat at the first sign of aggression. For hours, the bear remained preoccupied, tearing into salmon carcasses along the shore and occasionally sniffing the air. Igor slowly launched the drone. It buzzed quietly as it rose and moved steadily toward the bear. From Pavel's position, he watched the drone maneuver with practiced precision, maintaining a safe but close distance. Igor controlled it with ease, his focus fixed on the screen as the drone captured the bear's every move. Without warning, the bear's ears twitched, and it locked eyes with the hovering machine. For a moment, it remained still, muscles taut beneath thick fur. Then, with a sudden roar, it charged toward the airborne intruder. The drone jolted midair as the signal flickered. Igor struggled to regain control. As the bear bolted toward the tree line, Pavel realized it was headed straight for Igor. The drone dipped in altitude while Igor worked frantically to pull it back. Realizing the danger, Igor turned to run, his boots sinking into the muddy ground. His breath came in gasps, adrenaline surging, but the bear closed the distance quickly, crashing through the underbrush with devastating speed and power. Pavel tried to call out, but the moment had already turned deadly. The bear struck with terrifying force. Igor was knocked to the ground, his clothing and body torn by the animal's powerful claws. His attempts to defend himself were no match for the sheer strength of the predator. Pavel, frozen in place for a few seconds, could only watch in horror as the violent encounter unfolded just meters away. The sounds of the attack echoed through the forest, raw, primal, and merciless. The bear continued its assault until Igor's movement slowed, then ceased altogether beneath the predator's crushing weight. It was a grim and brutal end, a stark reminder of the wild's unforgiving nature. Nearby, the drone hovered briefly before the bear turned its rage on it. With 2 swift swipes, the animal destroyed the machine, sending shards of metal and plastic scattering across the forest floor. The advanced technology, a marvel of modern engineering, now lay broken and useless among the twigs and moss. Pavel's mind raced, terrified for Igor and overwhelmed by the chaos. He knew he had to act. He ran through the forest, pushing toward the nearest ranger station several kilometers away. Driven by panic, he pushed through exhaustion, branches scraping his face and legs burning with each step. Eventually, he reached the station and alerted search teams. A group of rangers armed with rifles, radios, and medical kits followed him back into the forest. The trail felt quiet and heavy on their return. Only rustling leaves and the distant sound of the river broke the silence. They found Igor's body in a clearing, torn and lifeless. The severity of the injuries left no doubt that survival had been impossible. Nearby, the shattered drone lay in fragments, a grim reminder of what had occurred. The incident shocked the scientific and drone communities. Experts raised urgent concerns about the risks of operating unmanned aircraft near apex predators. Calls for stricter regulations and improved safety protocols quickly followed. The wilderness, once again, had delivered a harsh lesson on the dangers it held. In the days that followed, Pavel grappled with grief and survivor's guilt. He had witnessed the unthinkable and led rescuers back to the scene, but the loss of his colleague left a deep and lasting scar. The forest, once filled with wonder and possibility, now felt cold and merciless. Despite the pain, Pavel made a vow. to honor Igor's legacy by improving safety standards and educating others about the real risks of wild encounters. Igor's passion for merging technology with nature had been inspiring, but the cost had been immense. The pursuit of knowledge, Pavel now understood, often came with staggering consequences. News of the tragedy spread far beyond the region, serving as a somber warning to drone operators, explorers, and wildlife enthusiasts worldwide. No device, regardless of its sophistication, could replace the respect and caution demanded by nature's most dangerous creatures. The bear's attack became an enduring symbol of the wild's raw power, one that Pavel and many others would never forget. Alex had long been drawn to the remote wilderness of the northern mountain ranges, a passionate angler and outdoorsman who sought solitude and the thrill of isolated fishing trips. In his early 30s, lean and experienced, he was no stranger to the risks of the wild, always approaching it with careful respect, honed over years of outdoor living. On May 30th, 2025, he camped beside a wide, slow-moving river deep in the rugged backcountry, an area well known for frequent grizzly bear activity. The air carried a crisp morning chill, and the forest around him whispered with the sounds of awakening wildlife. The previous evening had been peaceful. He spent hours casting along the river's edge, the steady flow of water and distant birdsong easing his mind. At dawn, he packed his gear and prepared to explore farther upstream, unaware that danger lay much closer than expected. The region was a known denning and feeding ground for grizzlies, including a female with cubs recently reported by wildlife officials. But Alex's thoughts were on the water, focused more on fishing opportunities than the unseen hazards nearby. As sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, he moved quietly through the underbrush. The damp earth beneath his boots felt soft and uneven, scattered with pine needles and decaying leaves. His backpack carried fishing rods, tackle, and basic camping supplies, while his hands gripped a small cooler with bait. The steady murmur of the river grew louder with each step. Hidden just off the trail, a large female grizzly rested in a shallow den, camouflaged by fallen branches and thick undergrowth. Two cubs, nearly a year old but already sizable, lay beside her, their small bodies rising and falling with each breath. Though appearing at ease, the sow remained alert, her senses finely tuned to any potential threat. Her maternal instincts were fierce, an ingrained readiness to defend her young with overwhelming force. Alex continued his careful approach to the riverbank, setting his sights on a promising new fishing spot. He failed to notice the subtle signs, broken twigs, disturbed earth, that hinted at the bear's presence. The stillness of the morning masked the tension in the forest. Then, with no visible trigger, the grizzly charged. The roar that followed shattered the calm, a raw, primal cry of defense and aggression. Alex froze for a split second, adrenaline surging through him. The suddenness of the encounter left no room to escape. He dropped his gear instinctively, the cooler and rods crashing to the ground as he tried to back away. With terrifying speed, the bear closed the gap. He raised his hands in an effort to appear non-threatening, but it was too late. The sow reached him in moments, her powerful jaws locking onto his right leg. Pain exploded instantly, sharp, blinding, and deep, as teeth tore into flesh and bone. The force of the impact hurled him to the ground, his body colliding with rocks and dirt. Driven by instinct, Alex grasped a thick branch from the ground and struck at the bear with everything he had. He pounded at its head and shoulders, fueled by fear and desperation. His shouts rang out through the trees, echoing against the trunks with raw intensity. Startled by the resistance, the bear hesitated. For a brief moment, its growls softened, and its eyes darted between Alex and the makeshift weapon in his hand. After a pause that seemed to stretch forever, the bear turned slowly and backed into the forest, disappearing with her cubs into the thick brush. Alex lay gasping, blood pooling around him, his body racked with pain and exhaustion. His leg was severely injured, torn, fractured, and bruised, but he was conscious, and he was alive. Summoning every ounce of remaining strength, he began crawling back to camp. Each movement was excruciating, but the will to survive pushed him forward. Eventually, he reached his campsite, dragging himself to his emergency signal device and activating it. Every noise in the forest kept him alert as he waited, unsure if the bear would return. Within an hour, a rescue helicopter arrived, and he was transported to a trauma facility. Doctors performed multiple surgeries to repair the extensive injuries to his leg. Over the following weeks, he endured pain, infections, and slow physical therapy sessions. The journey to recovery was grueling, but his determination remained unshaken. The incident served as a stark reminder of how unpredictable bear encounters could be, especially when cubs were involved. Wildlife experts emphasized the danger of surprising a mother bear, noting that even seasoned outdoorsmen could become victims of territorial aggression. Alex's ordeal became a cautionary tale, a vivid example of why vigilance and preparedness are essential in bear country. In the months that followed, Alex spent time reflecting on the incident with a deeper understanding. Years of wilderness experience had taught him many lessons, but this one came with a steep cost. He came to accept how narrow the margin for error could be in the wild. Respect, awareness, and humility were no longer just principles, they were survival tools. His physical scars would last, but Alex's spirit remained intact. The Grizzly's charge was both a terrifying ordeal and a transformative moment. It strengthened his resolve to educate others about the realities of venturing into predator-rich habitats. He began speaking about his story, urging fellow adventurers to learn from his experience and never underestimate the raw power of nature. Back in the forest, the rhythms of wildlife resumed. The mother bear and her cubs moved on, their presence marked by the lasting imprint they had left on one human life. For Alex, the path forward was shaped by pain, resilience, and a renewed commitment to coexist with the wild, not as its conqueror, but as a respectful visitor who had faced its fury and survived. Leah and Jason had spent years dreaming of escaping the relentless pace of city life for the quiet refuge of Oregon's vast, untamed forests. Both in their late 20s, they were skilled campers who prided themselves on their knowledge of wilderness safety and their deep respect for nature. On a clear, cool summer evening in early July 2025, they found themselves deep in the Cascade Mountain Range, far from any roads or trails, surrounded by towering fir trees and dense brush that blanketed the forest floor. The couple had carefully selected a small clearing to set up camp. They pitched their tent beneath the canopy of ancient evergreens, adhering strictly to established safety practices, particularly those concerning food storage. Their backpacks, heavy with supplies, were suspended from a sturdy branch well away from the sleeping area to reduce the risk of attracting wildlife. They had read numerous warnings about black bears in the area and were well aware of how easily one misstep could turn into a life-threatening situation. After a long day spent hiking along narrow, mossy paths beside rushing streams, Leah and Jason built a campfire to warm themselves and prepare dinner. The forest was already deep in shadow, with darkness settling over the trees. Birdsong faded into the rhythmic crackling of firewood, accompanied only by the occasional rustling of leaves stirred by the evening wind. Leah handled the meal preparation, carefully frying meat and vegetables in a small, greasy pan over a portable stove placed near the fire pit. The savory aroma mingled with the smoky scent of the fire, saturating the cool air around the campsite. Jason sat on a nearby log, peeling an orange and quietly observing the interplay of flame and shadow in the surrounding woods, content in the tranquil stillness. Then a subtle movement caught Leah's attention. Beyond the reach of the firelight, a shadow shifted quietly in the brush. Her breath hitched as she recognized the unmistakable silhouette of a black bear stepping from the undergrowth, its dark fur blending almost perfectly with the twilight. The animal moved slowly but with intent, clearly drawn by the smell of cooking food. Leah remained motionless, still holding the pan. Jason, too, had noticed the bear and watched intently as it crept forward, sniffing the air. The bear's eyes glinted faintly in the firelight, curious but wary. Both campers understood that the animal knew they were there, but hadn't yet decided whether to continue its approach or flee. Every second stretched out as the bear inched closer, its nose twitching at the scent of hot oil and meat. Leah held her breath, signaling to Jason to stay perfectly still. They both knew that sudden movement or loud noise might provoke an attack, and now, frozen in place, they silently hoped the bear would turn back. But then, a mishap shattered the stillness. Leah's grip faltered and the greasy pan slipped from her hands, clattering loudly onto the ground and spilling hot oil near the fire pit. The sudden sizzle was sharp and startling. Flames flared upward, catching the oil and sending a burst of sparks into the dry leaves around them. The bear reacted immediately. Instead of fleeing, it lunged toward the spilled food in a frenzy, toppling the fire pit in its rush. Flames burst outward and embers flew as the fire spread, fueled by oil and kindling. In an instant, chaos erupted. Jason sprang to his feet, adrenaline flooding his system. His thoughts raced. There was now danger from both the fire and the now agitated bear. The animal's form grew larger and more aggressive as it advanced. Its heavy muscles rippled under thick fur, and then it struck. Leah was caught by the bear's powerful swipe. Claws tore through her pants and sliced into her leg, leaving deep, ragged wounds. The force of the blow sent her stumbling backward, shock and pain rendering her momentarily unable to react. Jason, acting on instinct, grabbed a metal cooking pot and began smashing it against a nearby rock. He raised his voice in a series of sharp, commanding bursts, striking the pot repeatedly to create a harsh, disorienting noise meant to drive the bear away. Every moment hung in suspense as the bear paused, uncertain. The animal glanced between the flaring fire and Jason's loud disruption. Then suddenly it turned and bolted back into the forest, vanishing into the darkness and leaving behind a trail of broken brush and scattered debris. Jason rushed to Leah's side, his pulse hammering in his ears. Blood seeped from the deep gashes on her leg, staining the forest floor. Tearing fabric from his shirt, he quickly fashioned a crude bandage and wrapped it tightly around her thigh to control the bleeding. Leah gritted her teeth and braced herself against the pain, her body trembling with each shallow breath. Though injured and shaken, Leah stayed alert while Jason helped her prepare for the hike out. They knew they needed medical attention fast. Carefully, they extinguished the fire remnants, pouring water over the smoldering coals to prevent further spread. Their journey back through the forest was slow and tense. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the trees set their nerves on edge. The wilderness, once a place of peace and serenity, now felt ominous, but they pressed on, driven by the will to survive. Eventually, they reached a ranger station several miles away. Emergency responders were already mobilizing. Leah was quickly transported by air to the nearest hospital, where doctors worked to stabilize and treat her injuries. Her wounds were serious and required multiple surgeries, but thanks to her resilience and Jason's rapid response, permanent damage was avoided. The incident soon became a widely shared story within the outdoor community, underscoring the delicate balance between humans and wildlife in Oregon's wilderness. Officials pointed to the event as a reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control, from a dropped pan to a life-threatening encounter. They emphasized the importance of rigorous food safety protocols, proper fire handling, and calm decision-making during wildlife interactions. Leah and Jason's experience became a cautionary tale, recounted by hikers, campers, and nature lovers, as a testament to both the dangers of the backcountry and the importance of preparation. Though Leah carried physical scars from that night, she and Jason emerged with a deeper bond forged through survival. The forest remained a place of profound beauty, but now it also held a darker memory, of a night when danger came too close, and only calm minds and quick action made the difference between life and tragedy. The cabin stood silent beneath the low cloud cover, surrounded by the thick woods of Sakhalin Island. It was early morning on May 24th, 2025. Mist drifted low across the mossy ground as salmon-filled streams pulsed through the forest less than half a mile away. The Airbnb listing had promised tranquility, a rustic escape from city noise. For three friends, Mikhail, 38, a quiet software developer, Igor, 41, a rugged outdoorsman turned online host, and Artyom, 33, a school teacher recovering from burnout, it was meant to be a weekend of rest, campfire stories, and good food. But they had left food scraps in the trash can near the back door. Some packaging had been tossed behind the cabin after a late barbecue. They hadn't thought much of it. None of them imagined a bear might catch the scent. None of them remembered the host's warning printed near the cabin's entrance. Secure all food. Grizzlies frequent the area. At 4:27 a.m., Mikhail woke first to a sound he couldn't place. A low, dragging scrape, then a sharp knock, like wood splintering. It echoed from the back of the cabin. He sat up slowly in the darkness, heart suddenly hammering. A few seconds later, the sharp bang came again, louder now. Then the wood cracked. Something heavy crashed into the door. On the third strike, it exploded inward. Cold air burst into the small space. The dim moonlight framed a huge silhouette that ducked into the cabin. A massive Russian grizzly, its fur wet and matted, shoulders hunched like a charging tank. It moved fast, too fast for them to react. The bear surged forward, heading straight toward the small kitchen table where Igor had left his backpack filled with jerky and other snacks. In its fury, the animal knocked over a chair, smashing it into the wall. The noise woke Igor and Artyom just as the bear turned, catching their movement. The attack began in an instant. The bear lunged at Igor first, batting him aside with one enormous paw. Igor hit the floor hard, back scraping against a wooden bench. A deep gash split open across his chest where the bear's claws had struck. Blood smeared the wooden planks beneath him as he rolled away, groaning. Mikhail grabbed the metal fire poker beside the wood stove and swung it unthinkingly. The poker struck the bear's flank with a loud metallic thud. It roared in fury, twisting toward the new threat. It knocked Mikhail onto his back and drove a paw across his side. Bones cracked. He screamed as pain exploded through his ribs. The bear reared up, mouth open, fangs flashing, saliva dripping. Pale and trembling, Artyom grabbed the only thing within reach, a broken table leg, and ran toward the bear. He jabbed it into the bear's shoulder, barely piercing the fur, but the distraction worked. The bear turned to him and charged. Artyom didn't run. He ducked low, avoiding the first swipe, but the second struck his thigh and sent him backward. He slammed against the wall and fell in a heap, leg torn open and bleeding fast. The grizzly paced in a tight circle, growling, sniffing at the spilled food and blood. It seemed momentarily confused, surrounded by broken furniture and groaning bodies. Mikhail forced himself up, clutching his ribs. He saw the bear's attention shift toward Igor, who was crawling toward the bedroom. Summoning everything he had, Mikhail released a long, guttural scream and charged with the poker raised. He struck the bear again, this time across the muzzle. The bear roared in pain and rage, whipping its head around, jaws snapping. Mikhail fell back, hands shaking, heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the animal's growls. Igor, bloodied but determined, pulled a flare gun from his backpack inside the room. He aimed it shakily from the doorway. His fingers trembled as he fired. The flare burst with a blinding light and sharp hiss. It struck the cabin ceiling, setting a beam briefly aflame before extinguishing. The bear flinched at the flash, recoiling toward the broken door. It let out a deep growl and backed away, ears flat. The scent of smoke filled the air now, mixing with blood and the musky odor of the animal. The bear lingered one last second, then turned and bounded out into the dark. The silence followed was broken only by their ragged breathing and the creak of wood settling. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, on the walls, soaked into their clothes. Mikhail collapsed onto a chair, ribs screaming in pain. Artyom moaned softly from the wall. Igor clutched his torn chest and stared at the doorway. They didn't know if it would come back. They spent the next hour securing the cabin as best they could. Mikhail propped the stove against the destroyed doorway. Igor used a rope to tie furniture together in front of the opening. Artyom drifted in and out of consciousness, his leg bandaged with torn sheets. They wrapped their wounds as best they could and waited for dawn. The emergency beacon on Igor's phone finally caught a signal just before 6. A rescue helicopter didn't arrive until after 10. By then the cold had worsened the bleeding, and none could stand. The rescuers found them weak, battered, and barely coherent. All three were hospitalized in Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk. None suffered life-threatening injuries, though Mikhail needed surgery for cracked ribs and a punctured lung. Artyom underwent skin grafts. Igor, with the deepest claw wounds, bore long scars down his chest. The attack shocked local authorities and made national news. The cabin, advertised to tourists as a peaceful wilderness retreat, had not been properly inspected for bear safety. Food had not been stored in sealed containers, and no bear-proof garbage bins were present. The back door had been weakened by moisture and rot, barely enough to keep out wind, let alone a bear. Debates erupted about Airbnb safety standards in rural Russia. Conservationists pointed to the salmon streams and early bear activity in May as predictable risks. Others demanded tighter regulations for cabins near bear territory, especially concerning food storage and reinforced entryways. For Mikhail, Igor, and Artyom, it became a nightmare they would never forget. The sounds, the roar, the crash, the wet thud of claws against flesh haunted their sleep. They had come seeking peace. Instead, they found the raw violence of nature waiting just beyond the walls. The cargo vessel Arctic Voyager sliced slowly through the ice-choked waters of the Northwest Passage on a chilly, overcast afternoon in May 2025. Captain Sergei Ivanov, a seasoned mariner with decades of experience navigating these treacherous northern seas, kept a steady watch from the bridge. The world around him was changing fast. Melting sea ice opened new shipping routes that had been impassable only a few years ago. Yet the promise of quicker passages brought risks no one had fully anticipated. The ship's hold was packed tight with thousands of kilograms of salted and frozen fish, destined for remote Arctic communities. The strong smell of fish permeated the cold air, a faint but steady scent leaking through the seals of the refrigerated containers. The hold's doors were locked, but the bitter Arctic temperatures had started to thaw the seals and warp the metal edges, leaving small gaps. In the shifting ice and endless twilight, the Arctic Voyager was a beacon for more than just humans. After briefly docking at a tiny Arctic port along Nunavut's northern coast, the ship's crew performed routine checks. During the first watch, Nikolai and Alexei had been assigned to inspect the refrigerated cargo hold late at night. Nikolai was 28, a wiry deckhand from Murmansk with quick reflexes and a tough edge earned from years at sea. Alexei, 34, was a seasoned engineer. more cautious but steady under pressure. Descending the narrow metal stairwell, they stepped into the chilling cold of the hold, their breath visible in clouds. The floor beneath was slick with frost, and the faint glow from their flashlights cast eerie shadows across rows of stacked crates. The pungent odor of fish was stronger here, thick in the cold air. Nikolai's eyes flicked over the metal walls, sharp claws and scratch marks visible near the heavy hatch. A sudden low growl broke the silence. Both men froze. A massive white form erupted from the darkness like a ghost from the shadows. The polar bear stood nearly 10 feet tall on its hind legs, its thick white fur almost glowing in the faint light, and its dark eyes shining with wild hunger and desperation. It was a formidable force, a king of the Arctic's frozen wastes, but it was trapped in a place it did not belong. Nikolai shouted a warning, but his voice was swallowed by the bear's furious roar, which echoed through the hold like a thunderclap. The two men barely had time to react. Alexei grabbed a fire extinguisher, swinging it like a club, hoping to scare the beast away. The hollow clang of the extinguisher striking the bear's side seemed to irritate rather than deter it. With terrifying speed, the polar bear charged. Nikolai barely dodged a swipe of its massive paw, the heavy claws tearing the metal floor and kicking up shards of ice. The bear's momentum crashed into Alexei's left arm, shattering the fabric of his jacket and tearing deep into the flesh beneath. Blood seeped rapidly through torn skin, cold and sticky in the frozen air. His heart pounding, Nikolai grabbed a metal pipe from the nearby wall. He swung it with all his might, connecting with a harsh clang against the bear's snout. The animal snarled in pain but did not retreat. Instead, it pivoted and bit deep into Nikolai's right shoulder. Sharp teeth sank through muscle and bone, shredding flesh with horrifying force. Nikolai screamed silently, his vision blurring as the bear shook him violently. Summoning every ounce of strength, Nikolai jabbed the pipe into the bear's eye. The creature yelped, reeling back and pawing frantically at the injury. Alexei struggled to his feet, clutching his bleeding arm, and sprayed the fire extinguisher directly into the bear's face. The bear sneezed violently, stumbling backward, and its eyes watered. For a breathless moment, the threat seemed to pause. Then, with a sudden fury, it charged again, barreling toward the narrow stairwell that led back to the ship's upper decks. Nikolai and Alexei scrambled, bashing metal crates and railings, making as much noise as possible to intimidate the intruder. The bear halted at the base of the stairs, snarling and pounding the floor with massive paws, but did not follow. Gasping for breath, soaked in blood and pain, the two men collapsed against the cold steel walls. Nikolai's right shoulder was shattered, blood pouring from deep bite wounds. Alexei's left arm throbbed fiercely, bones bruised but intact. Their clothes were torn and stained. They knew the bear might return at any moment. Captain Ivanov was immediately informed. The ship's doctor came down with first aid supplies, applying pressure bandages and painkillers. Emergency communication was sent to the nearest Arctic medical facility, hundreds of miles away. As dawn broke over the ice, helicopters were dispatched. The Arctic Voyager's voyage was delayed indefinitely, while Nikolai and Alexei were evacuated for advanced treatment. Both men suffered serious but non-fatal injuries, deep puncture wounds, extensive bruising, and torn muscles. Surgeons would later confirm Nikolai had suffered partial nerve damage in his shoulder, threatening his ability to work at sea again. Later investigations revealed the polar bear had been drawn to the ship by the irresistible scent of fish. It had clawed its way through weakened seals and small gaps in the cargo hold, scavenging for hours before the crew's inspection. The damage was extensive. Crates were punctured, frozen fish spilled across the floor, and the scent had leaked into the port's quiet night air. Scientists studying the Arctic environment noted this was one of several recent incidents in which polar bears had come into direct contact with humans aboard ships and coastal settlements. Melting sea ice had forced the bears to alter their hunting patterns and seek food in new places, sometimes perilously close to human activity. The event triggered urgent discussions among maritime authorities and wildlife experts. It became clear that vessels operating in the Arctic needed better security measures, reinforced hold doors, electrified fencing systems, and trained wildlife deterrent teams to protect crews and wildlife alike. For Nikolai and Alexei, the ordeal left a permanent mark. The memory of that white fury, its wild eyes, powerful paws, and raw terror and pain would haunt them forever. Both men returned home with visible and invisible scars. They spoke little of the night, but carried its lessons in every cautious step afterward. The Arctic Voyager resumed its journey weeks later, sailing cautiously through shrinking ice fields. Yet the shadow of the bear's raid lingered, a stark reminder that the boundaries between human industry and wild nature were fragile and dangerous in this rapidly changing world. As the ship moved steadily north, the crew remained vigilant, knowing the Arctic was no longer a frozen wilderness, untouched by human presence. The polar bear's desperate raid was a warning. The frozen kingdom was shifting, and survival meant adapting to new rules where man and beast could no longer avoid crossing paths. The late summer evening settled softly over the small Vermont town of Millersville. The sun dipped low behind thick stands of maple and oak, casting long shadows across the streets. Jenna, a young woman in her mid-20s, who had worked as a clerk at Millersville Grocery for nearly 3 years, was finishing her closing routine. The store was modest, rows of fresh produce, canned goods, and household essentials, but it was the heart of the community. Jenna knew most customers by name and enjoyed the quiet moments when the last few stragglers left, and she could tidy the aisles before locking the doors. As she wiped down the counters near the front entrance that night, a faint rustling caught her attention from the back parking lot. Her brow furrowed. At first, she thought it might be a stray dog or a neighborhood cat, but the sound was heavier, more deliberate. She paused and glanced out the small window behind the checkout stand. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few parked cars bathed in the fading light. Near the back door, something large and dark shifted among the shadows. Jenna's heart quickened as she realized it was a black bear, a young male, his thick fur glossy under the streetlight, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The faint scent of ripe fruit and sweet berries had drawn him there. The bear seemed cautious at first, moving slowly toward the back door, which Jenna had forgotten to close tightly while bringing in a shipment earlier that day. The slightly ajar door provided an inviting gap, and the bear slipped inside without hesitation. Jenna's breath caught. She knew bears were common in the Vermont woods surrounding the town, but never had one ventured into a store before. The bear's large paws made heavy thuds on the tile floor as he entered, his dark eyes scanning the bright aisles lined with colorful fruits and vegetables. The bear ambled casually toward the produce section near the back, drawn irresistibly to the piles of apples, berries, and peaches stacked in open crates. Jenna moved cautiously behind a checkout counter, watching in awe and fear. The bear raised a massive paw and knocked over a display of apples, sending them rolling across the floor like marbles. He sniffed greedily, then grabbed handfuls of red and green fruit, stuffing them into his mouth with a crunch of skin and pulp. Despite the surreal calm of the moment, Jenna's pulse raced. The bear's low and rumbling growls vibrated like distant thunder. She knew she had to act carefully. Any sudden move might provoke him. After several minutes, she tried to guide the bear toward the exit. Stepping slowly from behind the counter, she raised her arms and made herself appear larger, hoping to intimidate it gently without startling it. The bear's head snapped up, and its eyes locked onto hers. They stared at each other for a tense heartbeat. Predator and human, worlds apart yet in the same space. Then, unexpectedly, the bear growled sharply and charged. Jenna stumbled backward, crashing into a canned goods display, rattling loudly but did not fall. She caught herself just in time, heart pounding wildly. The bear stopped inches away, sniffing the air between them, nostrils flaring. It seemed more startled than angry. Jenna backed away carefully, retreating toward a narrow corridor near the storage rooms. She knew that corner was safe, away from the main floor and near the back exit. Once behind a sturdy metal shelf, she pulled out her phone with trembling hands and dialed animal control. Her voice was low but steady as she explained the situation and requested immediate assistance. Minutes passed like hours. The bear, meanwhile, continued to roam the aisles, knocking over more displays and pawing at cartons of berries. Its movements were restless but not frantic, as if it were both curious and confused by the strange surroundings. Outside, distant sirens wailed, and the muffled voices of officers approached. The bear's ears twitched, nostrils flaring again. Slowly, it turned toward the open back door, lured by the noises and smells beyond. In a final glance back at the scattered fruit and toppled displays, the bear lumbered toward freedom and vanished into the night. Jenna exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands shook as she stepped out from her hiding place, carefully surveying the wreckage left behind. The store was messy, fruit crushed and bruised, toppled cans and dented shelves, but she was unharmed. The animal control officers arrived shortly afterward, securing the area and checking the parking lot for signs the bear might linger. They reassured Jenna and spoke of the challenges bears faced living close to human settlements, where food sources like garbage bins, bird feeders, and in rare cases, grocery stores created dangerous temptations. News of the bear's grocery store visit spread quickly through Millersville. Locals shared stories about the audacity of a wild animal wandering boldly into a store, the chaos and surprise it caused, and Jenna's quick thinking that prevented a worse outcome. For Jenna, the event was a reminder of the delicate balance between human life and the wilderness that surrounded them. The bear, driven by hunger and perhaps the loss of its natural habitat, had crossed an invisible line, reminding everyone that wild creatures remained close in the quiet towns near the forest, drawn by the scent of human food. Officials urged the community to be vigilant, secure garbage, avoid leaving food outdoors, and respect the bear's space. The story became a cautionary tale about the consequences of encroaching on wildlife territory and the surprising ways nature could push back. In the following weeks, Jenna often thought about the bear, how it had moved through the store with calm determination, how close danger it felt, and how fragile the boundary between safety and threat could be. The memory was vivid. The bear's dark eyes met hers, the soft crunch of apples beneath giant paws, and the wildness beyond the glass doors. Though the damage was minor compared to what might have been, the incident left an imprint on the town's collective memory, a repeated story, a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, the wild could appear suddenly and change everything. On May 10, 2025, deep in the wilderness of a remote region in eastern Russia, a campsite became the scene of one of the most horrific bear attacks in recent history. The dense forests of this area, known for their rugged terrain and diverse wildlife, had long been home to the formidable Ussuri brown bear, a subspecies of the grizzly bear noted for its immense size and power. That year, the region had endured an exceptionally harsh winter. Heavy snowfall and prolonged freezing temperatures had severely depleted natural food sources, pushing wildlife closer to areas of human activity in search of sustenance. Local rangers had issued warnings about increased bear activity, but those warnings went unheeded by a group of 6 friends from Moscow who were seeking adventure in the wilderness. Vladislav Kuznetsov, Anastasia Petrova, Mikhail Sokolov, Nadezhda Orlova, Igor Volkov, and Tatiana Morozova had been planning the trip for months. All in their late 20s, they were avid outdoor enthusiasts who met during their time at university and had remained close despite the demands of their professional lives. This journey was meant to be a long-awaited reunion. The group arrived at their chosen campsite on the afternoon of May 9th. They set up 3 tents in a clearing surrounded by towering trees and began preparing a meal over an open fire. According to later investigations, most of the food was properly secured in bear-resistant containers, but some snacks and cooking utensils were left exposed or inadequately cleaned. The night passed without incident. Vladislav and Anastasia shared one tent, Mikhail and Nadezhda another, and Igor and Tatiana the third. None of them were aware that a large male Ussuri brown bear, estimated to weigh over 350 kilograms, had picked up the scent of food carried on the night breeze. Wildlife experts later theorized that the bear, malnourished after the brutal winter, had been drawn to the site by residual food odors. At approximately 3:40 a.m. on May 10th, the predator approached the campsite. Investigators believe the bear first examined the area where dinner had been prepared before turning its attention to the tents. What followed was reconstructed through physical evidence and the testimony of the sole survivor. The bear attacked the tent occupied by Igor Volkov and Tatiana Morozova, tearing through the fabric with ease. The noise woke the others, but in the confusion and darkness, escaping proved nearly impossible. The bear moved quickly and aggressively between the tents. Mikhail Sokolov and Nadezhda Orlova attempted to flee, but were caught just meters from their tent. Vladislav Kuznetsov pushed Anastasia Petrova out of the back of their tent and attempted to divert the bear's attention using a flashlight. His actions gave her just enough time to escape into the forest, though she sustained deep lacerations to her back and shoulders during the escape. Severely injured and in shock, Anastasia Petrova managed to navigate through the darkness, following the distant sound of a river. For nearly 7 hours, she stumbled through the wilderness, losing blood and battling hypothermia. By extraordinary fortune, she reached a ranger station shortly after daybreak, where stunned staff immediately called for an emergency medical evacuation. When authorities arrived at the campsite later that day, they discovered a scene of unimaginable devastation. All 5 of Anastasia's friends had been killed, their bodies bearing clear evidence of the bear's overwhelming strength. Tracking teams with trained dogs located the animal approximately 4 kilometers from the site. Given the severity of the attack and the bear's demonstrated predatory behavior toward humans, wildlife officials made the decision to euthanize it. A forensic examination confirmed that the bear was a 12-year-old male, severely underweight for its size. It had broken teeth and signs of arthritis, conditions that likely contributed to its weakened state and abnormal aggression toward people. The incident sent shockwaves across the country and prompted federal authorities to introduce sweeping changes to wilderness safety policies. These included mandatory bear safety training for all camping permit holders, stricter regulations on food storage, and expanded ranger patrols during the spring months when bears emerge from hibernation in search of food. Anastasia Petrova spent 3 months recovering in the hospital. After her release, she became an advocate for wildlife conservation and bear safety education. In memory of her lost companions, she established a non-profit organization dedicated to promoting safe coexistence between humans and large predators. The foundation focuses on education and improved wilderness management practices. The attack stands as a somber reminder of nature's unpredictability and power, and of the importance of vigilance and respect when entering the domain of wild animals struggling to survive in increasingly challenging conditions. In the crisp autumn of 2013, a remote wilderness area in the American West was blanketed in golden hues as fall settled across the rugged terrain. Known for its geothermal features and abundant wildlife, this region held one of the densest grizzly bear populations in the contiguous United States. The surrounding ecosystem remained one of the few places where these apex predators had never been completely driven out, making it both a conservation stronghold and a zone of ongoing human-wildlife conflict. Baxter Thornfield and Reed McAllister had been close friends since their college days at Montana State University 2 decades earlier. Both had settled in Bozeman after graduation, Baxter working as a civil engineer, Reed as a high school science teacher. Their annual elk hunting trip had become a cherished tradition, offering a rare chance to disconnect from daily life and reconnect with each other and the wilderness they revered. That year, they secured a highly sought-after late-season elk permit for a rugged zone near the northern boundary of the protected area where limited hunting was allowed under strict regulations. As experienced outdoorsmen, they followed all safety protocols, carrying bear spray on their belts, storing food in certified bear-resistant containers suspended from trees, and processing any harvested game away from camp and downwind. However, an unusually dry summer had severely reduced natural food availability for the region's grizzlies. Park biologists had observed increased bear activity at lower elevations as the animals ranged farther in search of nourishment before hibernation. Some bears had even begun shadowing wolf packs to scavenge their kills, a risky behavior that brought them into closer proximity with humans. Baxter and Reed arrived at their remote campsite on October 29th, setting up their tent in a clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines. They spent the day scouting for elk sign and found promising evidence of a nearby herd. That evening, they cooked a modest meal using a portable stove and discussed their hunting plans before settling into their sleeping bags shortly after sundown. According to Reed's later statement to officials, he was awakened around 4:15 a.m. when Baxter mentioned he was stepping outside to relieve himself. After pulling on his boots and jacket, Baxter exited the tent with a small headlamp. Reed dozed off briefly, only to be jolted awake roughly 10 minutes later by low, guttural growls emanating from the edge of the campsite. When Baxter failed to return after several minutes, Reed called out for him but received no reply. Growing increasingly concerned, he quickly pulled on his boots, grabbed his rifle and flashlight, and stepped out of the tent. Sweeping the area with his light, he caught sight of a massive grizzly bear approximately 30 yards away. The bear was hunched over something on the ground that, with growing dread, Reed realized was his friend's motionless body. The bear immediately reacted to the light and Reed's presence, rising to its full height, estimated later at over 7 feet, and emitting a thunderous roar. Instead of charging, the bear turned back toward Baxter and began dragging the body toward the surrounding forest. Paralyzed by fear and shock, Reed made a decision that would weigh on him for years to come. Rather than attempting to intervene, an action later affirmed by wildlife experts as likely fatal, he scrambled up a nearby pine tree with low-hanging branches. From a height of about 15 feet, he watched helplessly as the grizzly disappeared into the dark tree line, dragging Baxter's body with it. Reed remained in the tree until first light, nearly 3 hours later. Disoriented and traumatized, he descended, gathered only his essential gear, and began a desperate 5-mile hike to the nearest ranger station. Officials from the wilderness area's bear management team, accompanied by armed personnel, responded swiftly to his report. Using trained tracking dogs, the team located Baxter's partially consumed remains about half a mile from the campsite. Nearby, they discovered the carcass of a young elk that the grizzly had likely killed the previous day. Evidence suggested that the bear had been actively feeding when the hunters unknowingly set up camp within its territory. DNA samples confirmed that the bear was a known male, approximately 12 years old, previously tagged as part of an ongoing wildlife monitoring project. Following protocol for fatal attacks exhibiting predatory behavior, officials made the decision to euthanize the bear. The animal was located and removed 2 days later. Investigators concluded that Baxter had likely stumbled into the bear's feeding area in the pre-dawn darkness, unintentionally provoking a defensive attack. However, the bear's subsequent behavior, dragging the body away, was considered indicative of a rare but documented shift from defensive to predatory behavior. Reed McAllister never returned to hunting after the tragedy. In the months that followed, he established the Thornfield Wilderness Safety Foundation in memory of his friend. The foundation focuses on bear safety education and conflict prevention, supporting initiatives such as improved signage near known feeding zones and mandatory bear safety training for all backcountry permit holders. The incident reignited debate over hunting practices in grizzly habitats, with conservation groups highlighting the increased risk associated with the presence of blood and carcasses. In response, several jurisdictions in the region introduced new regulations requiring hunters to carry bear spray and adhere to stricter meat storage and transport protocols. 5 years later, Reed published a memoir reflecting on his friendship with Baxter and the events of that ill-fated trip. In its final chapter, he observed that in the timeless interaction between humans and apex predators, people remain guests in a wilderness shaped by forces far older and more powerful than themselves, where even modern tools offer no guarantee of safety. In October 2011, the Gallatin Range in Montana stood resplendent in autumn glory, its lower slopes adorned with golden aspen, while early snowfall dusted the higher elevations. Part of a vast and rugged ecosystem, this mountain range formed a critical wildlife corridor between protected wilderness areas to the north. For generations, these mountains had provided premier elk hunting opportunities, drawing sportsmen from across the country to test their skills against the challenging terrain and elusive game. Alistair Montague had been hunting these mountains since childhood. At 42, the fifth-generation Montanan had accumulated decades of backcountry experience across the northern Rockies. A skilled taxidermist by profession, Alistair approached hunting with a reverence born from intimate knowledge of animal anatomy and behavior. He preferred to hunt alone, relishing the solitude and self-reliance that solo expeditions demanded. On October 17th, Alistair set out from the trailhead before dawn, planning a 3-day hunt in a remote basin he had scouted earlier in the season. The weather forecast predicted clear skies, with nighttime temperatures dropping into the teens. Ideal conditions for tracking elk as they moved to lower elevations, seeking food and shelter. By mid-morning on the second day, Alistair's persistence had paid off. He spotted a mature bull elk approximately 250 yards upslope and executed a clean shot that struck the animal's vital organs. The elk ran approximately 80 yards before collapsing in a small meadow bordered by dense pine forest. Following proper hunting protocol, Alistair waited 30 minutes before approaching to ensure the animal had expired humanely. Upon reaching the downed elk, Alistair began the meticulous process of field dressing, removing the internal organs to cool the meat quickly and prevent spoilage. He worked efficiently, using his specialized knives to separate the animal's hide and access the body cavity. So focused was he on his task that he failed to notice the disturbed vegetation and large paw prints at the forest edge, approximately 40 yards away. According to the account Alistair later provided to wildlife officials from his hospital bed, he had just completed the field dressing process when he heard a sudden crashing in the underbrush behind him. Turning, he saw an adult female grizzly bear charging directly toward him from less than 20 yards away. Despite having his rifle propped against a nearby tree, Alistair had no time to reach it before the bear was upon him. The initial impact knocked him face first into the elk carcass. The bear's weight, estimated later at approximately 350 pounds, crushed Alistair's right shoulder and collarbone. He felt the bear's teeth close around his upper arm, the pressure intense enough to splinter the humerus bone. Out of instinct, rather than conscious decision, he rolled into a protective ball, covering his neck and head with his arms. In a fortunate twist that wildlife biologists later identified as critical to his survival, Alistair's hunting rifle, a weatherproof Remington 700 and 300 Winchester Magnum caliber, was positioned between his body and the bear during part of the attack. The sturdy wooden stock partially absorbed several bites that would otherwise have penetrated Alistair's torso. The rifle was later recovered with the stock splintered and bearing distinct tooth impressions. After what Alistair estimated was about 45 seconds of intense mauling, the bear suddenly ceased its attack. Through the haze of shock and pain, he perceived the animal standing over him, huffing and swaying. Behavior experts later interpreted as the grizzly determining whether the threat had been neutralized. After what seemed like an eternity but was likely only moments, the bear turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving Alistair bleeding heavily in the alpine meadow. Despite catastrophic injuries, including a shattered right arm, 4 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and deep lacerations to his back, side, and scalp, Alistair maintained consciousness. Drawing on decades of wilderness experience, he knew his survival depended on immediate action. Using his undamaged left hand, he retrieved the emergency medical kit from his pack and applied quick-clot gauze to the most severe wounds. He then secured his mangled right arm against his chest, using his hunting vest as an improvised sling. With extraordinary fortitude, Alistair began the agonizing journey uphill to reach higher ground where his satellite GPS emergency beacon might transmit more effectively. Each step sent waves of pain through his body, and blood loss gradually weakened him. It took nearly 3 hours to cover less than half a mile of terrain. At a small ridgeline clearing, Alistair activated his emergency beacon and collapsed against a boulder. The GPS device transmitted his coordinates to emergency services shortly after 4 p.m. Search and rescue teams mobilized immediately, but deteriorating weather conditions prevented helicopter evacuation until the following morning. Alistair endured a night of sub-freezing temperatures, fading in and out of consciousness as hypothermia compounded his injuries. At dawn, a break in the storm allowed a rescue helicopter to reach his location. First responders found him in critical condition, but still alive, a testament to his wilderness knowledge and sheer determination. At the hospital, trauma surgeons worked for 11 hours to repair the damage to Alistair's arm, chest, and internal organs. Medical staff later remarked that his exceptional physical conditioning and immediate first aid measures were crucial factors in his survival. Even so, his recovery required months of hospitalization and rehabilitation. Doctors salvaged his arm, though with permanently limited function and chronic pain. Montana fish, Wildlife and parks officials investigated the incident and determined that the grizzly had likely been in the process of claiming the elk carcass when Alistair inadvertently positioned himself between the predator and the food source. DNA samples collected from Alistair's clothing identified the bear as a known sow with 2 yearling cubs, though the cubs were not present during the attack. Following department policy for defensive bear incidents with no history of problematic behavior, officials did not attempt to locate or remove the bear from the wild. When able to speak with investigators, Alistair insisted that he harbored no ill will toward the grizzly, acknowledging that he had entered her territory and that she had behaved according to her nature. His perspective impressed wildlife managers who invited him, once recovered, to participate in hunter education programs focusing on bear safety in grizzly country. 6 months after the attack, with his right arm supported by a complex brace, Alistair appeared before the state legislature to advocate for a bill requiring all backcountry hunters to carry bear spray. His testimony, delivered in a matter-of-fact manner that belied his harrowing experience, helped secure passage of the measure by a narrow margin. Though he never regained full use of his dominant arm, Alistair returned to hunting 2 seasons later, always with a partner, always with bear spray accessible on his hip, and always with a deeper respect for the apex predators with whom he shared the wilderness. Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, Russia, May 5, 2025. In the dense forests of a remote Far Eastern island, a quiet war raged between conservation efforts and illegal logging. These ancient woodlands, among the oldest in the hemisphere, had become prime targets for timber traffickers who exploited the region's isolation to funnel rare wood into black markets abroad. That morning, veteran police officer Mikhail Kuznetsov led a team into the wilderness for what was expected to be a routine patrol. With 15 years of experience enforcing wilderness law, he had navigated some of the most remote terrain in the country. This mission was aimed at verifying reports of unauthorized logging activity within a restricted area in the island's northeast. Kuznetsov's unit included 9 members: Sergeants Dmitry Volkov and Yelena Petrova, Corporals Anton Sokolov and Nikolai Baranov, Officers Ivan Morozov, Alexei Popov, Svetlana Orlova, and Fyodor Lebedev, a new recruit only 3 months into service, participating as part of his field training. Recent intelligence suggested that the loggers were using radio signal detectors to monitor law enforcement movements. To minimize the risk of interception, Kuznetsov ordered strict radio silence. All devices were to remain powered off until absolutely necessary. At 7:30, the officers departed in 3 off-road vehicles, navigating unmarked service roads as far as possible before continuing on foot. The morning was typical of early spring, 12 degrees Celsius with light cloud cover and increased wildlife activity due to the early thaw. Unbeknownst to the team, a wildlife advisory had been issued just 30 minutes after their departure. Local biologists had confirmed the sighting of a large female bear with 3 cubs in the same sector the unit was entering. The bear was well known to rangers for her size and defensive behavior when with young. By late morning, the officers had divided into 3 groups to surround what was believed to be a logging camp. The maneuver, intended to isolate suspects, had an unintended consequence. The groups had unknowingly formed a perimeter around the bear's den site. As the eastern team advanced, Lebedev, partnered with Sergeant Petrova, noticed signs of recent animal activity: claw marks on bark, fresh tracks, and scat. He felt a growing unease, but bound by the silence protocol, could not voice his concerns. Just before noon, Officer Morozov, unaware of the den's location, closed to within 10 meters. The bear erupted from her hidden shelter, driven by instinct to protect her cubs. Weighing over 650 kilograms, she charged with lethal force. Morozov had no time to react. The attack was immediate and fatal. The roar of the bear and the sudden screams shattered the silence. Officers nearby heard the commotion but lacked clear direction. Without live communication, the response became fragmented. Some moved toward the noise, others froze or held position in confusion. Kuznetsov and Volkov fired warning shots to scare the bear off, but the sudden gunfire only intensified the animal's panic. Surrounded and perceiving multiple threats, the bear charged again. In minutes, the team was overrun. Her path was erratic but decisive, targeting movement, noise, or anything resembling a threat to her cubs. Petrova instructed Lebedev to stay completely still if the bear came close. He obeyed without hesitation, dropping to the forest floor and remaining motionless, face pressed into moss and mud. For 17 agonizing minutes, he stayed that way, listening to chaos, screams, then silence. When he finally dared to lift his head over an hour later, the forest was still. The bear and her cubs had vanished into the trees. The clearing was littered with the bodies of his comrades. Lebedev, shaken but alive, retrieved a powered-down satellite phone from Kuznetsov's pack and contacted emergency services. It took rescue teams 3 hours to reach the location. By the time they arrived, Lebedev had gathered the fallen into a single clearing using a tarp and lengths of cord from their gear. In the aftermath, the loss of 8 trained officers shocked both the public and enforcement community. Investigations were swift. Analysts determined that the team's communication blackout had prevented them from receiving the wildlife advisory, information that would almost certainly have changed their mission plan or delayed it altogether. Within days, internal protocols were overhauled. Continuous radio contact during all wilderness operations was made mandatory, and wildlife risk briefings became standard procedure for all mission prep. Real-time monitoring of environmental advisories became a non-negotiable part of field planning. A memorial was later installed at department headquarters in Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk. It bears the names of the fallen officers and stands as both a tribute and a reminder. Lebedev, the sole survivor, declined reassignment to administrative duties. Instead, he returned to field operations and eventually took on a leadership role in training new recruits. His instruction now includes a full-day scenario drawn directly from that tragic event, covering not only wilderness survival, but the crucial importance of adaptability, real-time information, and situational awareness. Lebedev would later incorporate the lessons of that day into every aspect of his training curriculum. His sessions emphasized not just tactical discipline and environmental awareness, but the unpredictable nature of the wilderness itself. He taught recruits that not all threats are human, and that in the forest, silence isn't always safety. Sometimes it's a warning you don't hear until it's far too late. Porcupine Creek Canyon, nestled deep within the rugged backcountry of southwestern Montana, had been Wesley Thornton's second home for more than 3 decades. At 58, he was a revered figure among the region's outdoor professionals, a traditional hunting guide whose reputation was built on an impeccable safety record, unwavering discipline, and a profound respect for the natural world. Thornton's outfitting company embodied a no-frills ethos grounded in precise knowledge of the high-country wilderness, and it was consistently booked years in advance by hunters who valued expertise and reliability above all else. The arrival of autumn transformed the Montana mountains with striking intensity. By late September, golden aspen groves blazed across the valleys, while the first dustings of snow began to cling to shaded ridges and rocky outcrops. For seasoned guides like Thornton, these seasonal markers carried deeper significance than mere beauty. They signaled shifting patterns of wildlife behavior, particularly among the area's increasing population of apex predators, bears, mountain lions, and wolves responding to the encroaching winter and dwindling food sources. Thornton's final client of the season was a 53-year-old orthopedic surgeon from the upper Midwest. Though an experienced hunter with over 20 years pursuing game across the continent, this was his first expedition into wilderness territory, known for large predators. At the trailhead on the first morning, Thornton delivered his customary safety briefing. Without uttering a word aloud, his methodical actions conveyed everything. Careful demonstration of deterrent spray use, rigorous scent control measures, and a strict emphasis on constant vigilance when moving through dense forest or open alpine meadows. It was a tacit understanding. Respect the wilderness, respect its dangers. The first 4 days of the expedition unfolded smoothly. Game signs were abundant, weather conditions favorable, and the client proved both capable and respectful of the environment. On the 5th day, conditions were nearly ideal. Cool air, steady wind, and low cloud cover combined to keep animals active and visible. By mid-morning, the client harvested a mature bull elk in a quiet alpine meadow located roughly 8 miles from their base camp, a remote site chosen for its strategic vantage and relative seclusion. What followed was a physically demanding yet routine task, field dressing the elk and preparing the meat for transport. Thornton approached the work with his characteristic precision, carefully ensuring the meat would cool efficiently by spreading tarps over shaded ground and securing the area from scavengers. Neither man suspected the unseen consequence of their activity. The scent of fresh blood had traveled down the canyon, carried on the crisp wind, and acted as an unintentional signal to a nearby predator. Wildlife officials later determined that a young adult male bear, struggling to prepare for hibernation after an unusually dry summer, had been drawn to the scent. The bear's natural forage had been drastically reduced, and competition from other predators further restricted scavenging opportunities. Faced with scarcity, the animal's behavior grew desperate and uncharacteristic. The first warning of imminent danger came from the horses tethered near the clearing's edge. They shifted uneasily and emitted distressed vocalizations. Thornton immediately recognized the signs, his gaze sweeping the surrounding tree line. Emerging from a dense stand of pines, the bear stepped into view, just over 40 meters away, nostrils flaring as it locked onto the scent. Without hesitation, Thornton moved to place himself between the bear and his client. He drew a revolver he had carried for years, but had never previously needed to use in defense. The bear's posture left no room for doubt. This was no casual investigation. It was a deliberate, aggressive advance. When the bear closed to 20 meters, Thornton fired a warning shot into the ground. The thunderous report echoed through the canyon, yet the animal remained undeterred. Instead, the sound seemed to trigger an escalation. The bear dropped its head and charged with terrifying speed and force. The attack came swiftly, the collision sending Thornton backward, his body pounding the earth beneath the bear's enormous weight. The assault lasted less than 2 minutes, but was brutal beyond measure. Nearby, the client remained frozen, obeying silent commands to stay still despite a primal urge to flee. The sounds of crashing limbs, guttural breaths, and raw violence filled the air. Eventually, the bear tore away a large portion of the elk and vanished into the forest. Thornton, grievously wounded, was still alive. The client's instincts took over. He rushed to his guide's side, immediately attending to deep lacerations across Thornton's torso and neck, a puncture wound in his upper leg, and severe blood loss. Using supplies from their emergency kit, he stabilized the wounds and activated a satellite beacon to summon rescue. Rescue teams arrived just over 90 minutes later. A helicopter touched down nearby and paramedics administered treatment in the field. Thornton remained conscious throughout, even offering a final piece of practical advice rooted in experience before the airlift. Despite the swift response, he succumbed to internal trauma during the flight, passing away before reaching the nearest emergency facility. Wildlife officers tracked and humanely euthanized the bear several days later. DNA analysis confirmed its involvement in the attack. Further examination revealed the animal was severely malnourished and suffering from an infected wound, likely sustained during a previous encounter with hunters. These compounding factors appeared to have driven its abnormal and aggressive behavior. The tragedy sent ripples through outdoor and hunting communities across the region. Although Thornton had acted strictly according to established protocol, his death sparked urgent re-evaluation of field practices. Within 6 months, new regulations took effect in multiple wilderness areas. These included mandatory use of scent-proof storage containers and requirements that all field dressing take place at a safe distance from camps or kill sites. At the remote trailhead where the expedition had begun, a modest bronze plaque now commemorates Wesley Thornton's life. His name became synonymous with integrity, expertise, and a quiet, unwavering reverence for the wild places he loved. In the months following the incident, the surviving client established a non-profit foundation in Thornton's honor. The organization provides safety training, wilderness education, and deterrent equipment to hunters and hikers traveling through predator-inhabited backcountry. Its mission is clear: to equip future travelers with knowledge and tools that foster greater awareness and respect for the complex ecosystems they explore. Wesley Thornton's legacy endures not only in memorials and stories, but in the informed caution carried by those who venture into the same wild spaces, places where awe and danger exist side by side, demanding respect and preparedness from all who enter. Lake Gogebic, Michigan, February 3, 2009. In the depths of winter, Michigan's Upper Peninsula becomes a realm of silence and snowdrift. Lake Gogebic, the largest natural inland lake in the region, freezes to a solid sheet of ice by February, thick enough to support vehicles, snowmobiles, and the makeshift villages of ice fishing shelters that appear each year like clockwork. To those who lived here or returned annually, it was a place of solitude, challenge, and seasonal ritual. Thaddeus Kowalczyk, a 36-year-old tradesman from a lakeside town further east, was among the dedicated few who braved this icy expanse each year. Ice fishing wasn't just a pastime for him. It was tradition, solitude, and a brief reprieve from the demands of modern life. He set out alone in early February, as he always did, with a custom-rigged snowmobile, a portable ice shelter, and provisions for a full week on the ice. The winter of 2009 was unforgiving. Temperatures stayed well below -20 degrees Celsius, with frequent wind gusts that made exposed skin sting in seconds. Kowalczyk's shelter, insulated and fitted with a small propane heater, offered relative comfort against the deep freeze. He had set up 2 kilometers from the nearest shoreline, an area known to local anglers for consistent walleye and perch activity. Wildlife experts would later point to the unusual behavior of black bears that winter. With milder mid-season thaws followed by abrupt cold snaps, hibernation patterns were disrupted. Some bears, confused by the erratic climate and struggling with limited food, had resumed wandering despite the deadly cold. Few people considered bears a threat in February, but nature, as it turned out, wasn't following the rules that year. On February 2nd, Kowalczyk had a banner day. 8 keeper walleye and a large northern pike came through the ice. As usual, he cleaned the fish outside and discarded the remains in nearby abandoned holes, thinking little of it. The scent, however, lingered on the wind. By 5 a.m. the next day, the shelter sat in absolute stillness under a sky full of stars. Kowalczyk was half asleep, curled in his sleeping bag, when a faint scraping sound reached his ears, barely audible over the hum of the heater. He ignored it at first, assuming it was snow shifting in the wind, or perhaps frost crystals brushing the fabric walls. The sound grew sharper, more intentional. Then the side flap of the shelter abruptly tore open. Cold air rushed in, along with the unmistakable form of a black bear. It was emaciated and restless, likely drawn by the fish scent and desperate enough to approach even in the biting cold. In the tight space of the shelter, barely 2 meters across, Kowalczyk and the bear found themselves inches apart. The bear hesitated. Its breath curled in white plumes, and its eyes reflected the glow of Kowalczyk's headlamp. Time seemed to stall. Then it moved forward, inch by inch, shoulders squeezing through the gap in the flap. Kowalczyk's hand scrambled through his supply box until he found the emergency marine flare. His fingers, stiff with cold, struggled to strike it. When it finally ignited, the flare bathed the shelter in a harsh red glow, filling it with acrid smoke and a searing light that reflected off the bear's dark coat. The confined space magnified the chaos, the smoke, the light, and the sudden noise. The bear swiped. One paw raked across Kowalczyk's left thigh, slashing through his pants and cutting deep. Pain burst through him like a lightning strike. Fueled by panic and instinct, he kicked with his right foot and waved the burning flare toward the animal's face. The bear flinched and backed out, retreating into the early morning darkness beyond the flap. Knowing this was his only chance, Kowalczyk bolted from the shelter, barefoot and wrapped in a torn sleeping bag. The cold hit him like a hammer. He could feel the numbness setting in almost immediately, but he sprinted across the slick ice toward his snowmobile about 30 meters away. Behind him, the bear returned to the shelter, rummaging through what was left in search of food. Kowalczyk reached the machine, half delirious from pain and cold, and managed to start the engine after 3 attempts. He tore across the frozen lake, heading toward the only place he knew might have help, a small private resort nestled on the western shore. He arrived, shaking and near collapse. The resort owner, a woman in her 60s who lived on site year-round, opened her door to find him bleeding, barefoot, and barely coherent. Her quick thinking, administering basic first aid and calling for emergency services, likely saved his life. He was transported to a regional clinic where he spent 3 days recovering from hypothermia, deep lacerations, and frostbite on both feet. Wildlife officials later located the bear still near the destroyed shelter. It was tranquilized and examined, revealing a fishing lure embedded in its lower jaw, infected and swollen. The injury had likely prevented the animal from eating properly for weeks. After medical treatment, it was relocated to a more suitable habitat farther north. Kowalczyk's physical recovery was swift compared to the mental toll. The memory of waking to see a bear pressing into his shelter lingered, vivid and invasive. He described it later to local reporters not with bravado but with quiet awe. an encounter with something primordial, something ancient and indifferent. He eventually returned to ice fishing the following year, but never again alone. He now carried more than just gear, satellite communications, additional flares, and a new awareness of how quickly routine could collapse into survival. The incident prompted local authorities to revise safety recommendations for winter anglers, particularly in remote areas. New signage, pamphlets, and training emphasized secure waste disposal and the possibility, however remote, of encountering wildlife year-round. For Kowalczyk, the trip that had once been a retreat from life's noise became something else entirely, a testament to resilience and a sobering reminder of the wilderness's capacity for both beauty and danger.